He could have had any woman in the world. But this billionaire chose the one woman everyone else had already walked away from. An exhausted single mother, flat broke, raising 2 kids alone with a heart that had been broken so many times she'd stopped counting. What nobody saw coming? Those kids would end up teaching him what family really means. If you've ever believed that real love finds you exactly when you've stopped looking, stay with me. This story is for you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And let's go back to a rainy Thursday night in Philadelphia, where 2 broken lives collided in a hospital waiting room, and nothing was ever the same again. The night Damian Hayes first saw Claire Monroe, he almost didn't go inside. He sat in his black Escalade in the hospital parking lot for 4 full minutes, engine running, rain hammering the roof in heavy sheets, the yellow glow of the emergency entrance burning cold and pale through the windshield. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands like he needed something solid to hold on to. He hated hospitals, had hated them for 6 years, ever since the last time he'd walked out of one without the person he'd walked in with. But Sophie was in the back seat, 7 years old, her small right hand wrapped in a dish towel that had gone pink around the palm, trying very hard not to cry. That was the thing about Sophie. She never cried. Even at 5, when she'd finally understood in whatever way a 5-year-old understands that her mother wasn't coming home, she'd just pressed her lips together and gone very still. Damian sometimes thought that was the thing that scared him most about his own daughter, how early she had learned to hold things in. "It doesn't hurt that bad," Sophie said quietly from the back seat. Damian looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were glassy but dry. "I know," he said. He turned the engine off and got out of the car. The waiting room was exactly what he remembered, that particular shade of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. The hard plastic chairs bolted together in long rows. A television mounted high on the wall, cycling through a local news segment. Nobody was watching. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee, and something else beneath it, something human and tired that no amount of industrial cleaning could fully remove. Damian carried Sophie through the automatic doors with her hand pressed against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He checked in at the front desk, gave their information to a woman who typed without looking up, and then turned to find 2 seats. That was when he saw her. She was sitting 3 rows back from the entrance, beneath one of the harshest overhead lights in the room, which somehow made her more visible rather than less. A woman in pale blue scrubs that had the specific look of clothes worn through a full shift and then worn again, wrinkled in the places that don't unwrinkle, no matter how you sit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had been neat at some point earlier in the day, but was now coming loose at the sides. She had shadows under her eyes, the color of bruises. She was holding a little girl on her lap, maybe 4 or 5, half asleep, face pressed into her mother's shoulder, and beside her sat a boy of about 9, his left arm wrapped in an ace bandage, holding a paper cup of juice with his good hand. The boy was trying to read a magazine that was clearly meant for adults, flipping through it with the mechanical focus of a child pretending to be occupied. Damian found 2 seats near the wall and settled Sophie into one of them, sitting beside her, pulling out his phone more out of habit than purpose. He wasn't going to answer emails. He wasn't going to call anyone. He just needed something to look at that wasn't the room. But he kept looking at the room. Specifically, he kept looking at that woman 3 rows back. Not in the way men usually looked at women in his world. Calculating, assessing, already composing the opening line. It wasn't that. It was something harder to name. She was clearly running on empty. Everything about her posture said it. The way her shoulders curved forward slightly, the way she shifted the sleeping girl every few minutes as if her arms had gone numb, but she wasn't going to put her down. And still she was talking quietly to her son, pointing at something in the magazine, asking him questions, keeping him engaged. Even now. Even at whatever hour this was, in a hospital waiting room, after what had clearly been a long and punishing day. Damian watched her and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition, not attraction, not yet. Just the strange, quiet recognition of someone who was also exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. The juice cup fell 15 minutes later. The boy had been balancing it on the armrest while he turned a page, and then his elbow shifted and the cup hit the floor and the orange juice spread fast across the linoleum in a wide, flat arc that reached the shoes of an older couple 2 seats away. The boy went rigid with embarrassment. "Oh, for heaven's sake," the older woman said sharply, pulling her feet back and looking down at the spreading puddle with the expression of someone who had been personally wronged. "I'm so sorry," Claire said immediately, already moving, setting her sleeping daughter carefully across two chairs, standing up, looking around for something to clean it with. "I'm so sorry. He didn't mean to—" "You need to control your children," the man beside the woman said flatly, not looking at her. Just stating it, like a fact, like it was obvious. Claire's face did something complicated. The embarrassment was there, visible and hot, but underneath it was something older and heavier. The expression of someone who had heard variations of this sentence so many times that she'd stopped fully flinching. She was already moving toward the nurse's station, asking for paper towels, apologizing again to the receptionist, apologizing to the room in general in that reflexive way some people develop when they've been made to feel like an inconvenience for long enough. Her son had gone very still. He was staring at his feet. Damien was already moving before he'd consciously decided to. He picked up the empty cup from the floor, folded his jacket over his arm, and crouched down to the linoleum. He didn't have paper towels either, but he had the sleeve of his jacket, which was dry cleaning, not a hospital floor, but it was there and it would work. He pressed it against the juice and began mopping it up. "You don't have to do that," Claire said, returning with a fistful of brown paper towels and stopping short when she saw him on the floor. "It's fine," Damien said. "That jacket is—" She stopped, looked at it, clearly recognizing that it cost more than several of her paychecks. "Please don't do that with your jacket. It washes." He took the paper towels from her hand, not in a showy way, just practically, and finished the job. The older couple had already turned away. The moment had passed for them. For the boy, it hadn't. Damien stood up and looked at him directly. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy blinked. He'd been bracing for something else. A lecture, maybe. Or more embarrassment. "Marcus?" he said carefully. "Marcus, you know what I did last month at a board meeting?" Damien said. "Knocked an entire pot of coffee across a table of contracts. In front of 14 people. He paused. "Cost a lot more than orange juice to fix." Marcus stared at him. Then slowly, something in his face loosened. Claire was watching Damien with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said finally. Her voice was quiet and genuine and slightly guarded, the way people sound when they're grateful but haven't decided yet whether to trust it. "It's a waiting room," Damien said simply. "Everyone in here's already having a bad night." He went back to his seat. Sophie was watching him with wide, serious eyes. "Who's that lady?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said. But they ended up sitting near each other for the next 2 hours. Not by design. The room filled up as the night went on, and the available seats clustered naturally, and at some point Sophie fell asleep against Damien's arm, and the little girl woke up and wandered over to look at Sophie with the bold, unselfconscious curiosity of a 4-year-old examining something interesting. "She's sleeping," the little girl announced to Claire. "I can see that, baby. Come back here. She has pretty hair. Emma, come here." "It's okay," Damien said quietly, glancing down at the little girl standing 2 feet from his knee. "She won't wake up. Sophie sleeps like a brick." Claire pulled Emma back onto her lap anyway, but she didn't move away. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The particular silence of two people who are too tired for performance and have stopped trying. "How'd she hurt her hand?" Claire asked eventually, nodding toward Sophie. "Climbing a bookshelf," Damien said. "Trying to get a book down from the top shelf. I told her to ask me." He exhaled through his nose. She decided she didn't need to ask. Claire almost smiled. Marcus broke his wrist last year doing the same thing. Different shelf. Same logic. She glanced at her son, who had finally found a section of the magazine he seemed genuinely interested in. "How old?" "7. Marcus is 9. Acts like 30. She paused. "Some days." Damien looked at his daughter's face, slack and peaceful in sleep. "Sophie acts like she's 45, he said. "Has since she was 4. Claire was quiet for a moment, then, "Just you two?" The question was casual, conversational, the kind of thing you ask in a waiting room, but it landed somewhere particular in his chest. The way those questions always did. The ones that required a short answer that was also a long story. "Just us two," he said. "Yeah." She nodded, didn't push. He appreciated that more than she knew. "You?" he asked. She looked at Marcus, then at Emma, sleeping against her arm again. Just the three of us, she said, and her voice was even, practiced even, but there was something in the set of her jaw that told him the evenness had been worked for. They called Sophie's name 20 minutes later. The cut was superficial, a clean slice from a shelf bracket that looked worse than it was, required 4 stitches and a bandage, and terrified Damien far more than it seemed to terrify Sophie, who held completely still during the sutures and told the nurse that she had a high pain threshold. The nurse looked at Damien. He shrugged. She tells me this regularly. When they came back out to the waiting area to collect his jacket and Sophie's sweater, Claire was still there. Marcus had fallen asleep across 2 chairs, his magazine open on his chest. Emma was asleep again in her mother's lap. Claire was awake, staring at the news ticker running across the bottom of the television screen, her face blank in the way faces go blank when the mind has gone somewhere else entirely. She looked up when they came back. Her eyes went immediately to Sophie's bandaged hand. "She okay?" she asked. 4 stitches. "She's fine," Damien said. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it. "Your son, Marcus. His arm?" "Sprained, not broken, they think," she exhaled, waiting on the X-ray confirmation. "Good. Good that it's not broken." "Yeah." She nodded, looked back at the television. Damien stood there for a moment, Sophie's small, warm weight leaning against his side, and he felt the pull to just walk out. Back to the parking lot, back to the Escalade, back to the life that was structured and managed, and very good at keeping the world at a slight remove. Instead, he said, "Is there someone coming to help you get them home?" She looked at him. It was the first time he'd seen something fully unguarded in her face, just for a second. Surprise. And beneath the surprise, something rawer, the expression of a person who was so accustomed to managing everything alone that the question itself caught her off balance. "No," she said, "but I'm fine. I've got it." "I know you do," he said, and he meant it. Everything about her said she had it, had been having it, by herself for a long time. "I just meant, if you need a cab or something. I have a car." A small pause. "Thank you, though." He nodded, looked down at Sophie, made himself move toward the door. "Hey," Claire said. He turned. She was looking at him with that same guarded, genuine expression from earlier. "Thank you for what you did, with the juice, and—" She stopped. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus looked like he needed a break, Damien said simply. Something moved across her face that she controlled quickly. She nodded once. "Yeah," she said quietly. He did, but he thought about her on the drive home. Not obsessively, not romantically, just the way you think about a stranger after an unexpected moment of human contact, turning it over once or twice before it settles. He thought about the way she'd kept apologizing to strangers who hadn't deserved the apology. He thought about Marcus's face when Damien told him about the coffee. He thought about the particular quality of her exhaustion. Not dramatic, not performed, just very real and very well managed. Sophie was asleep again in her car seat by the time they hit the bridge, her bandaged hand resting in her lap, face turned toward the window. "Dad?" she said suddenly, without opening her eyes. He'd thought she was asleep. "Yeah?" "That boy, Marcus." A pause. He was embarrassed. "I know. You made it better." He didn't answer right away. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the city lights were smearing gold across the wet bridge cables. "I tried," he said finally. Sophie was quiet again. Then, "The lady was tired." "Yeah, she was." "Like you're tired." He looked at her in the mirror. Her eyes were still closed. "Go to sleep, Soph." She didn't say anything else. Damien Hayes had built his life in 3 distinct phases, and he understood them clearly enough to describe them without flinching. The first phase was the building years, his 20s, when he'd worked with the particular ferocity of someone who had something to prove, and wasn't entirely sure yet what it was. He'd started Hayes Development Group at 24 with $160,000 borrowed from 2 different people who told him it was a bad idea, and he'd turned it into something worth hundreds of millions by the time he was 29. That part of the story got told at business conferences sometimes. He always left out the years of 17-hour days, the lease agreement he'd nearly lost over a forged inspection report, the months when he wasn't sure he was going to be able to make payroll. The second phase was the marriage years. He'd met Rachel at 28, at one of those events where everyone is dressed well and talking about things that sound important, and almost none of it means anything. She was the only person in the room who seemed to find the whole spectacle slightly absurd. They'd gotten together in the way people get together when they recognize each other, quickly, inevitably, with a slightly startled feeling of finding something you hadn't known you were looking for. Those years were the best of his life. He knew that clearly and without sentimentality. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. He'd worked too much. She'd carried more of the domestic weight than was fair and had told him so directly, which he'd respected even when it made him feel guilty. They'd fought over money once, which seemed ironic in retrospect, and over his mother twice, which seemed inevitable, but they'd also built something real together, a home that felt inhabited, a life that had texture. Sophie had been born when he was 29. He'd held her in the delivery room with the specific terror of someone who understood for the first time that love could be this immediate and this total, and that was exactly what made it so frightening. Rachel had laughed at his face. He'd looked at her over Sophie's head and felt something he still didn't have a word for. Then Rachel had gone to see her college roommate in Boston for a long weekend when Sophie was 14 months old. She never came home. The accident had been on a Tuesday, on a wet stretch of interstate outside of Providence, and it had involved a pickup truck and a driver who later tested positive for 3 different substances, and it had lasted approximately 11 seconds, according to the police report. The time it took for the truck to cross the median and impact the driver's side of Rachel's car, and for Rachel's heart to stop. 11 seconds. Damien had spent the following 2 years in a state he'd never adequately described to anyone. Not grief, exactly, though it was grief. More like the experience of having the entire architecture of your life removed overnight and being left standing in the space where it used to be, expected to function. He'd functioned. He'd gotten Sophie through toddlerhood into childhood, kept the company running, hired the right people, bought the right buildings. He'd done all of it. But there was a layer beneath the functioning where the light had gone out and stayed out, and he'd gotten used to it the way people get used to anything. Because the alternative was not getting used to it. He was good at his job. He was good at being Sophie's father in the specific ways he'd taught himself. Showing up, being present, learning her preferences and her rhythms, making sure she felt secure in the particular way that children who have lost a parent need to feel secure. He was good at those things. He was not good at letting people in. Had not been really since the night in Providence when the last person he'd fully let in had disappeared from the world in 11 seconds. The offices of Hayes Development Group occupied the 32nd through 35th floors of a glass tower in Center City, Philadelphia, and on the Monday morning after the hospital visit, Damien was in his corner office by 7:15, going through the site assessments for a mixed-use development project in Fishtown that his team had been working on for the better part of a year. His assistant, a quietly efficient woman named Patricia, who had worked for him for 4 years and knew better than to ask how his weekend was, brought him coffee and his calendar and a note that his 11 o'clock had asked to push to 1:30. "Fine," he said, without looking up. Also, Sophie's school called, something about the costume for the class play next week. They need to know by Wednesday. He looked up. "What class play?" Patricia looked at him. "Right," he said. "I'll call." She left. He went back to the site assessments and got approximately 4 minutes of work done before he put the papers down and looked out at the city below him and thought about a woman in a hospital waiting room with shadows under her eyes and a sleeping child on her lap and a son whose face had gone rigid with humiliation over a spilled cup of juice. He didn't know why he was still thinking about her. He picked up the site assessments and went back to work. He saw her again 3 weeks later. He was picking Sophie up from school, one of the twice-weekly days when he did it himself rather than sending their housekeeper, Margaret, and he was running 5 minutes late because of a conference call that had run long, and he was walking fast through the parking lot trying to make up the time when he nearly walked into her. She was coming out of the school's main entrance with Emma on her hip and Marcus a half step behind, moving with the same efficient, slightly harried energy he'd clocked in the hospital waiting room. She saw him the same instant he saw her, and for a moment they both stopped. She looked startled. Then something settled in her face. "Hospital Dad," she said. He blinked. Am I Hospital Dad?" "I didn't know your name," she said simply. She shifted Emma on her hip. "Your daughter goes here?" "Sophie, 2nd grade. You?" "Marcus is in 4th. Emma's in pre-K." She glanced toward the building. "They do afternoon pickup at the same time, which is logistically impressive," he said. Chaotic, she said. The word is chaotic. He almost smiled. Damien, he said, extending his hand. Damien Hayes. She shook it with her free hand, Emma dangling from the other arm, unimpressed by the introduction. Claire Monroe. How's Marcus's arm? Sprained, like they thought. He's fine. Annoyed that he can't play basketball for 3 weeks, but fine. She looked at his hand. Sophie's stitches? Out last week. She's telling everyone she has a scar. Does she? Barely, but she's committed to the narrative. Claire looked at him for a moment. Not unfriendly, just measuring, the way people measure when they're being careful. Well, she said, good to know they're both okay. Yeah. He paused. Are you... He stopped himself because the question forming in his head was about whether she had someone helping her, which was not his business and which she'd already answered in the waiting room. Are Marcus and Emma in the after-school program? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, she said. I work nights, so I pick up the other days when I can. She said it neutrally, factually, not inviting comment. What do you do? Nursing assistant, Jefferson Hospital. She said it the same way, direct, without apology, without the slight lift in delivery that people use when they want you to be impressed. Sophie came flying out of the building at full speed and crashed into Damien's side with enough force to rock him sideways. Dad, you were late! 4 minutes. 5. 4.5. Sophie looked at Claire, then at Emma, who was staring at her with round, interested eyes. Hi, Sophie said. Hi, Emma said solemnly. I'm Sophie. I'm Emma. I like your backpack. Emma looked down at her backpack, which had a cartoon dinosaur on it, considered the compliment gravely, and appeared to accept it. Thank you, she said. Claire was watching this with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. We should get going, she said. Yeah, Damien said. She put Emma down and took her hand and started toward the parking lot. Marcus fell into step beside her, already talking about something, pulling a paper from his backpack. Sophie watched them go. Who's that? She asked. Claire, he said. We met at the hospital, remember? The boy who spilled the juice. Sophie thought about this. And the tired lady, she said. Yeah? She watched Claire's retreating figure for another moment. She still looks a little tired, she said. Sophie, I'm just saying. He took her hand and steered her toward the car. He ran into Claire Monroe 4 more times over the following 6 weeks. Once at the grocery store on a Sunday afternoon, where she was in the cereal aisle with a calculator on her phone, comparing unit prices between 2 boxes with the focused attention of someone who needed the math to work. He'd almost said something, then hadn't, and then she'd looked up and seen him, and the moment for pretending not to notice had passed. Once at the school's fall fundraiser, where she was working one of the game booths because Marcus's class had been asked to provide parent volunteers, and there weren't enough parents, so Claire was covering 2 slots, running the ring toss for 4-year-olds with the steady, slightly mechanical cheer of someone who has been running ring toss for 4-year-olds for 90 consecutive minutes. Once outside the coffee shop on Walnut Street, where she was on her phone, her voice low and tight in the way voices get when someone is trying to have a difficult conversation in a public place without being overheard. He'd caught the tail end of something that sounded like a landlord, and something about the heat not working, and something about a lease clause. And then she'd seen him, and her expression had shut down, and she'd wrapped up the call with a decisiveness that was clearly about him being there more than about the call being done. And once, at the end of October, in the school pickup line at 3:15 on a Tuesday, standing 4 feet apart in a queue that wasn't moving because someone had double parked at the front of the line, and it had created a bottleneck that was now backing up the entire block. They'd stood next to each other for 11 minutes, while the situation resolved itself with agonizing slowness, and they'd talked, really talked, for the first time, without the hospital context or the 5-minute window of a parking lot. He'd learned that she'd grown up in Allentown, that she'd come to Philadelphia for a nursing program that she hadn't finished because Emma had arrived earlier than expected, and the logistics had become impossible, and she was working toward her RN certification in whatever hours she could find between night shifts and school pickup, and the specific grinding arithmetic of a single income stretched across 3 people. She'd learned that Hayes' development was his, that he'd started it from close to nothing, that he still walked every property he was considering purchasing rather than sending someone else because he trusted his own eyes more than most reports. He'd learned that her husband had left when Emma was 8 months old. She'd said it the way you say things you've said so many times they've lost some of their charge. not without emotion, but with the practiced steadiness of someone who has told this particular story enough times to no longer be destroyed by the telling. He hadn't asked details. She hadn't offered them. But something about the way she said, "he left." Not "he left us," or "the marriage ended," or "we split up," just the clean, flat "he left," told him everything the details would have added. She had not asked about Rachel. He hadn't offered. But she'd noticed, he thought, the same way he'd noticed things about her. The slight calibration of a person who understood what it meant to be raising a child alone. By the time the pickup line started moving, Damien realized he'd been standing in it for 11 minutes and had not thought once about the Fishtown project or the quarterly reports or the call with his legal team that was at 4 o'clock. He thought about that on the drive home. He asked her to dinner in November, on a Wednesday, in the parking lot after school pickup. He'd been turning the idea over for about 2 weeks and had managed to talk himself in and out of it several times, which was not a thing that happened to him often. Damien Hayes was, professionally and personally, a person who made decisions and acted on them. But this felt different. She felt different, and the difference made him careful in a way he hadn't been careful about anything that wasn't a business deal in a long time. He caught her at her car, a 10-year-old Civic with a cracked passenger mirror that had been reattached with what appeared to be electrical tape, while Marcus was loading Emma into her car seat. "Hey," he said. "Can I ask you something?" She turned, read his expression, and he thought read it correctly, because something shifted in her face that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite anticipation, but was somewhere in between. "Okay," she said carefully. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Nothing with... I'm not trying to make it into something it isn't. I just think you're interesting, and I'd like to talk to you without a parking lot or a school pickup line." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a nursing assistant," she said. It wasn't self-deprecating, it was just information, delivered clearly, like she was reading from a fact sheet. "I work night shifts. I drive a car with electrical tape on the mirror. I have 2 children who would need to be accounted for before I could go anywhere for dinner." "I know," he said. "You know." "You just told me." She almost laughed. Almost. "Damien. Claire." She looked past him for a moment, at nothing in particular, and he could see her running some internal calculation. Then she looked back at him. "Why?" It was a plain question, genuine, not fishing for a compliment, actually asking. "I just told you," he said. "You're interesting. There are interesting people who don't come with my level of complicated." "I'm aware." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me." "I don't," he said. "I feel like you've managed things that would have flattened most people, and I'm curious about who you are outside of managing things." Something moved across her face, quick and complicated and controlled fast. "Okay," she said finally. He blinked. "Okay." "Don't make it weird." She opened her car door. "Next Friday, I'll see if my neighbor can sit with the kids." He stood in the parking lot and watched her pull out, and Sophie appeared at his elbow. "Did you ask the tired lady to dinner?" she said. He looked down at her. "How did you—" "I could tell." She considered this. "Good. She should eat more." He stared at his 7-year-old. "What?" Sophie said. "The restaurant was a place on Spruce Street that Damien liked. Not ostentatious, not trying to be impressive, just good food and low lighting and tables spaced far enough apart for actual conversation. He'd been there a dozen times. It felt like a reasonable choice. Claire walked in wearing a blue dress that she'd clearly put thought into and was now slightly second-guessing because she tugged the hem of it once after she came through the door and then stopped herself. And when she saw him, she had the expression of someone who was going to refuse to be nervous about this. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "You look—" "Please don't," she said. "Like someone who got a full night's sleep, which I'm guessing was not an accident." She paused. Then, "I took the day shift yesterday specifically to make sure I wasn't working tonight. So," a small, self-aware smile. "It was not an accident." They sat. They ordered. The first 20 minutes had the particular energy of 2 people who are both comfortable with silence trying to figure out which of them was going to go first. And it was Claire who went first, asking him about the Fishtown project in a way that made it clear she'd paid attention in the parking lot conversations. And the conversation opened up from there. She was sharper than her exhaustion usually allowed to show. He'd sensed that in fragments, the way she framed questions, the precision with which she'd laid out her situation in the parking lot earlier in the fall, but over dinner, with a full night's rest, and the slightly loosening effect of a glass of wine and a situation that didn't require her to be managing anything, she was formidably sharp. She had opinions about the city, about what was happening to neighborhoods she'd watched change, about hospital policy and the gap between nursing assistants and nurses, and what the actual difference was in the day-to-day work. She was funny in a dry, observational way that required you to be paying attention to catch. He was paying attention. Halfway through the entree, she put her fork down and said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. Her hands were flat on either side of her plate, which was a thing he'd noticed she did when she was bracing. "I have 2 kids," she said. "That's not— I know you know that, but I mean it as a real statement, not just information. They are my first priority and my last priority and everything in between. They're not a complication I work around. They're just—" She stopped. Started again. "What I'm saying is that if this is something where you see them as an obstacle, or something you tolerate to be around me, or something you eventually ask me to choose between, I can't do that. I won't." She paused. "So if that's what you're looking for, you should know that now and walk away, and it's fine, and I won't think less of you." She said it evenly, firmly, with the particular dignity of someone who had delivered this speech before and been answered badly, and was delivering it again anyway because it was still the truth. Damien looked at her. "Can I see a picture of them?" he said. She blinked. "What?" "A picture of Marcus and Emma." He held her gaze. "You just told me the most important thing about your life. I'd like to see them." For a moment, she just looked at him. Then, slowly, she picked up her phone. The photo she showed him was from Halloween, Marcus in a homemade astronaut costume that had clearly involved significant effort and a hot glue gun, Emma in a dinosaur suit that matched the backpack Sophie had complimented, both of them standing on a front step with their arms full of candy, Marcus grinning, Emma with her mouth already full. "That dinosaur thing," Damien said. "Is that a whole— She has a whole dinosaur theme?" "Since she was 2.5, Claire said. Dinosaurs and only dinosaurs. We're in year 2. "Sophie went through a phase where she would only wear one specific pair of socks," he said. "For 4 months. We almost needed a therapist." Claire looked at the photo, then back at him. Something in her face had changed, had loosened a little. The brace had softened. "They're great," he said simply. "They're clearly yours." She looked at him for a moment. "They are," she said quietly. They stayed until the restaurant started stacking chairs around them. He drove her home because she'd taken a rideshare over and the night had gotten cold, and when he pulled up in front of her building, a 3-story walk-up in South Philly with a front stoop that had seen better days and a buzzer panel with half the labels missing, she undid her seatbelt and sat for a moment in the way people sit when they're not quite ready for something to end but are going to end it anyway because they're practical. "Thank you," she said. "This was—" She stopped. "Good. This was actually really good." "Yeah," he said. "It was." She looked at the building, then at him. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't know what I'm doing." "Me neither," he said. She looked slightly surprised by that, like she'd expected him to have a clearer position. "Okay," she said. "Well." She reached for the door handle. "Good night, Damien." "Good night, Claire." She got out, walked up the front steps, and he waited until she was inside before he pulled away. He drove home through the dark, quiet streets of South Philadelphia, past the lit windows and the corner bars and the row houses packed tight together with their whole lives visible in frames of yellow light. And he thought about the way she'd put her hands flat on the table when she was bracing for something, and the way her face had changed when he'd asked to see the picture, and the very particular thing she'd said. "They're not a complication I work around." He thought about Sophie asking him, from the back seat of a car, in the dark, "Are you going to be sad forever, Dad?" He'd said no, of course. He'd meant it when he said it. He'd just never had a clear answer to what came instead of sad forever. He drove home and went upstairs to check on Sophie, who was asleep in her room with one foot hanging off the bed and her arms thrown over her head in the boneless sprawl of a child who had been fully unconscious for hours. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. He didn't know what he was doing either, but he drove home that night, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind not knowing. The second date happened because Sophie asked about Emma's dinosaur. It was a Saturday morning, 3 days after the dinner on Spruce Street, and Damien was making pancakes, the only thing he reliably cooked without incident, when Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair still flattened from sleep, and said, without preamble, "Did you see Claire again?" He flipped a pancake. "What?" "The lady from the hospital. Did you see her again?" "We had dinner," he said carefully. Sophie climbed onto a bar stool at the kitchen counter and propped her chin on her hands. "Does she have a dinosaur?" "Her daughter Emma has a dinosaur backpack and a dinosaur Halloween costume." "I want to meet Emma," Sophie said. "Sophie, I'm just saying. I know you're just saying." He slid a pancake onto a plate and set it in front of her. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He looked at his 7-year-old, who was regarding him with the particular expression she used when she thought he was overcomplicating something obvious. He didn't have a good answer that a 7-year-old would accept, partly because the real answer was layered and personal, and partly because he wasn't entirely sure he understood it himself. "Syrup," he said, instead of answering. Sophie reached for the syrup bottle and let the subject drop, which he appreciated. She had the rare quality, even at 7, of knowing when to push and when to leave it. Rachel had been the same way. He'd always suspected Sophie had inherited it directly. He called Claire that afternoon. She picked up on the 4th ring, slightly out of breath, with the sound of Emma in the background demanding something with the relentless persistence of a 4-year-old who has decided that now is the moment. "Hold on," Claire said, away from the phone. Then, "Emma, I will look at the dinosaur in 1 minute. I'm on the phone." A brief pause. "Sorry," she said to Damien. Hi. Bad time." "It's always a bad time," she said, and he could hear the smile in it. "What's up?" "Sophie wants to meet Emma," he said, "because of the dinosaur thing." A beat of silence. Then Claire said, carefully, "Did Sophie decide this? Or did you decide this? And Sophie is your cover story." He paused. "Both," he said. "Honestly, both." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh properly. Not just almost laugh, not just the controlled near smile from the parking lot, but actually laugh, unguarded, the kind that gets away from you before you can decide whether to let it out. It only lasted a second, but it landed on something in his chest like a hand pressing gently on a bruise. "The park on Christian Street," she said. "Tomorrow at 2. Don't be late this time." He was on time. The park was a small neighborhood square with a fenced-in playground in the corner and a row of benches along the south side where the afternoon sun came in at a good angle in November. Emma and Sophie found each other within 45 seconds in the way that small children find each other. No introduction required, no preamble, immediate and total mutual interest based solely on proximity and shared access to a slide. Within 3 minutes, they were at the top of the play structure together, Emma narrating something to Sophie with great authority, Sophie listening with complete seriousness. Marcus sat on a bench with a book, which appeared to be his natural state. "He always does that?" Damien asked. Claire was watching the girls on the slide. "Since he learned to read, I used to try to make him put it down and socialize." She paused. "Then I realized he was socializing fine. He just does it through books first, people second. The books are how he decides if people are worth the people part." "What's he reading?" She glanced over. "Some science thing about black holes. His teacher gave it to him." She said it with the particular tone of a parent who is proud of something and trying not to make a big deal of it. Damien looked at Marcus, the kid sitting alone on a bench with a black holes book at age 9. He thought about his own childhood, the particular loneliness of being the kid who was more interested in floor plans and building structures than in whatever everyone else was interested in, the way he'd spent most of 5th grade drawing blueprints of imaginary buildings in the margins of his notebooks. "He'd probably like the observation deck of the Kimmel Center," Damien said. "Good sight lines to the sky." Claire glanced at him. "He would love that, actually," she said. Then, more carefully, "You don't have to do that." "I know. I mean it. You don't have to perform interest in my kids to impress me." He looked at her. "I'm not performing." She held his gaze for a moment. The directness of it was something he'd already noticed about her. She looked at you when she was trying to figure something out, fully, without the social deflection most people used. It could be uncomfortable if you weren't prepared for it. "Okay," she said. "Marcus?" Damien called. The boy looked up from his book with the slightly dazed expression of someone returning from a significant distance. "What's a black hole do to time?" Damien asked. Marcus stared at him. Then his face did something, shifted, opened up, recalibrated entirely. He put the book down on the bench beside him and turned his whole body toward the question. Okay, so time dilation is... He stopped, started over. You know how gravity works, right? Damien sat down on the bench. 40 minutes later, Claire said, Marcus, let the man breathe. Marcus, who had at some point in the conversation stood up from the bench to gesture more effectively at the sky, stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Damien, suddenly aware again of where he was and who he was talking to. The enthusiasm retreated slightly behind the 9-year-old caution. Sorry, Marcus said. Don't be, Damien said. You were explaining something. Finish it. Marcus looked at his mother. She gave a small shrug that meant suit yourself. He turned back to Damien and finished the explanation. Claire watched them from the other end of the bench, not participating, just watching. The girls had abandoned the slide in favor of some elaborate game in the sandbox that appeared to involve dinosaurs ruling the solar system. The afternoon light had gone gold and low. She had her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had been empty for 20 minutes, and she wasn't looking at her phone, and she wasn't mentally somewhere else. She was just there. It had been a long time since she'd been able to just be somewhere. She noticed that with the specific awareness of someone who doesn't get it often enough. The 3 weeks after the park were not a romance in any clean narrative sense. They were fragments. A text thread that started because Claire had sent a link to an article about a Philadelphia zoning dispute that she'd thought of him while reading, and he'd responded, and then they'd kept responding back and forth until the conversation had migrated from zoning to hospital staffing policy to whether Marcus's black hole explanation had been scientifically accurate, which Damien had looked up and reported back, and then somehow it was midnight and he was still texting a nursing assistant in South Philly about gravitational time dilation. They had coffee twice during her afternoon windows between shifts and school pickup, at a place on Passyunk that was halfway between Jefferson Hospital and her apartment. He learned that she took her coffee with 1 sugar and no milk, and that she'd been doing it that way since she was 17, which struck him as the kind of specificity that told you something about a person. Not what exactly, but something. She learned that he'd bought his first development property, a rundown duplex in Kensington, at 23 by convincing a seller to accept a deferred payment structure because he hadn't had enough cash to close otherwise. Did that actually work? She asked. It worked because the seller was also 23 and didn't know it wasn't standard practice, he said. We were both making it up. She looked at him over her coffee cup. You've been making it up the whole time, haven't you? Everyone is, he said. Some people just have better offices while they do it. She went quiet for a moment, turning the cup in her hands. I used to think that, she said, that everyone was figuring it out as they went, and I was the only one who felt like I was behind. And then she stopped, started over, and then things got harder, and I realized that some people had real safety nets, and that makes a bigger difference than the attitude does. Yeah, he said, it does. She looked up at him. He didn't add anything to it, didn't qualify it or redirect it or offer the kind of reframe that people offer when they want to make something feel better than it is. He just agreed with her, and the not qualifying it was somehow more respectful than anything else he could have said. She thought about that later when she was on the night bus back to her apartment after the second coffee, watching the city go dark outside the window with Emma asleep against her shoulder and Marcus reading beside her with a headlamp because the bus lighting wasn't good enough. He didn't try to fix things. That was what she kept coming back to. She'd been around enough men, her ex-husband included, who fixed things, who reframed things, who found the silver lining whether or not you'd ask them to find it. Damien Hayes, who had more actual capacity to fix things than anyone she'd ever met, mostly just listen. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she kept not doing something about it, which was its own kind of answer. December arrived fast, the way December always did in Philadelphia. One morning, the trees still had their last leaves, and the next morning, everything was bare, and the city had put up its lights, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 4 days, and everyone walked slightly hunched against the wind with their shoulders up around their ears. Claire was working 36 hours a week, picking up extra shifts where she could, because December meant higher utility bills, and the kids' school winter play required costume pieces she hadn't budgeted for, and Marcus needed new sneakers, again, because his feet were engaged in some kind of sustained growth campaign that she couldn't keep up with. She was tired in the bone-deep way she was always tired in December, the cumulative weight of a year that had asked more of her than she had. She'd told Damien about the heat in October, on the phone in front of the coffee shop, the landlord dispute, The clause in the lease about maintenance timelines, the apartment that had gone cold for 9 days before anyone fixed it. She hadn't meant for him to hear that. He had anyway. In the second week of December, he texted her. "Is the heat working?" She looked at the text for a moment. "Yes," she wrote back. "Why?" "Just checking." She stared at the screen. She thought about typing something else, about how she didn't need anyone checking on her heat, about how she had it handled, about the specific and well-worn discomfort of being someone that other people felt sorry for. She thought about the calculator at the grocery store and the electrical tape on the car mirror and all the small compromises she'd built into the architecture of her daily life that she'd long since stopped seeing as things that needed changing. She didn't type any of it. "Thank you," she wrote instead. He sent back a single thumbs up. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. The thing that kept happening, the thing that kept catching her off guard, was the consistency. Not grand gestures, not the helicopter ride to an island kind of effort that her ex-husband had deployed occasionally in the early years when he'd done something wrong and needed to reset the emotional ledger. Just consistent, quiet, ordinary presence. He texted when he said he would. He showed up to the two things they'd planned both times early. When Marcus had mentioned in passing, during the park conversation, that his science project required poster board, and he couldn't find the right kind at the corner store. A package of assorted poster board appeared on Claire's doorstep 2 days later with a note that said Fishtown Hardware, Aisle 4. They have the good stuff and nothing else. She'd stood on her doorstep holding the package and felt, for a moment, the old instinct to be suspicious of it. The instinct that said nobody does things for free, that kindness had a return expectation built into it, that the cost came later. She'd learned that lesson so thoroughly that it had become automatic. A reflex planted so deep she sometimes couldn't tell the difference between intuition and scar tissue. She called her sister Diane in Allentown that night. "He sent Marcus poster board," she said. "That's a weird thing to send," Diane said. "He mentioned needing it in a conversation Damien wasn't even really part of. Damien just remembered and sent it." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Claire, I know. How long has this been going on? It's not... We've had dinner once, coffee twice. Claire, he sent your son poster board. I'm aware. That's not a we've had dinner once behavior." She pressed her back against the kitchen wall and looked at the ceiling. Emma's dinosaur drawings were taped up in a row above the refrigerator, 6 of them in various sizes. Marcus's science quiz from last month was on the fridge door with a 94 written in red at the top, which he'd been quietly devastated about because he'd wanted 100, which was a thing she'd chosen not to push on because the kid was 9 and a 94 was a 94. "I'm scared," Claire said. "I know," Diane said, "but you're always scared. For good reasons." "For reasons that made sense at the time," Diane said, which is not exactly the same thing. She went to bed that night and lay there for a while, listening to the building settle and Emma breathing through the wall and the distant sound of the city, and she thought about what Diane had said, and she thought about the poster board, and she thought about a man on the floor of a hospital waiting room mopping up orange juice with the sleeve of a very expensive jacket, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She fell asleep before she'd figured out what to do with any of it, which was, she supposed, its own kind of forward motion. The week before Christmas, Marcus's science project was due. He'd been working on it for 3 weeks. A model of the solar system with handwritten labels and a separate display board explaining the physics of planetary orbit, which he'd expanded to include a section on black holes because, he said, it was related and his teacher had approved the addition. Claire had helped where she could, which meant mostly providing tape and staying out of the way, because Marcus had strong opinions about the project and her involvement in it, and she'd learned years ago that some things were best handled by being available rather than involved. The night before it was due, at 9:30 p.m., she was washing dishes when Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face had the particular look it got when something was wrong that he was trying to decide whether to tell her. "What?" she said. "I broke the Saturn ring," he said. She turned around. He was holding the model, a styrofoam ball on a wooden dowel with rings made from a wire frame and acetate paper, and one side of the ring was cracked clean off, hanging loose. She looked at it. She looked at the clock on the microwave, 9:34 p.m., project due at 8 a.m. "Okay," she said. "Where's the glue?" "I already tried glue. The acetate doesn't stick." She took the model from him and examined the break. He was right. Regular craft glue wasn't going to hold the acetate to the wire frame. She needed something stronger. She went through the kitchen drawer, the junk drawer in the hallway, the small toolbox in the closet. She had wood glue and regular super glue, and neither was right. "Mom, I'm thinking," she said. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Damien. "Sophie wants to know if Emma liked the dinosaur stickers we sent. She's been waiting for a verdict." She looked at the text. She looked at the broken Saturn ring in her hand. She looked at the clock. She hesitated for only a second. "Are you awake?" she typed. "Yes." "What's wrong?" She almost wrote nothing. The word was right there, automatic, the answer she gave when she didn't want to ask for help, which was most of the time. Saturn ring broke. "School project. Due tomorrow, 8 a.m. Need something that bonds acetate to wireframe, and I don't have it." The response came back in under a minute. "Epoxy. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Who are you texting?" Marcus asked. "Damien." Marcus looked at her, then at the broken ring. "You called him for a school project?" "He offered," she said, which was a slight reframing of events, but directionally accurate. "It's almost 10 o'clock. "I know what time it is, Marcus." Her son was quiet for a moment. He had the focused, measuring quality when he was thinking something through. The same quality he'd had at the park when he'd decided to trust Damien with the black hole explanation. "Okay," he said finally. Damien arrived in 22 minutes with a 2-part epoxy kit, a set of small clamps, and a piece of replacement acetate. He'd stopped at a 24-hour hardware store on the way. Claire opened the door and took one look at him. Coat still on, slightly out of breath from the stairs, hardware store bag in hand, and felt something move in her chest that she made a note of and did not address right then. "The acetate might not match exactly," he said, coming inside. "But I got the closest thickness they had." "Thank you," she said. "You really didn't have to. You said it was due at 8. Where's Marcus?" Marcus was at the kitchen table with the model, and when Damien came in, the boy looked up with an expression that moved quickly through several things. The wariness, the assessment, the grudging admission that the situation had been improved by this arrival, and landed somewhere close to relief. "The break is clean," Damien said, examining it. "That's actually good. Should bond straight." "I tried regular glue," Marcus said. "Acetate needs epoxy." Damien set the hardware bag on the table. "You want to do it, or you want me to do it?" Marcus thought about this seriously. "You do it, but I watch." "Deal." Claire stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them at the kitchen table at 10 p.m., Damien's coat still half on, explaining 2-part epoxy to a 9-year-old who was watching the process with his chin propped on his hands and asking precise follow-up questions. And she had the overwhelming, slightly terrible feeling of someone watching something they want very badly and are very afraid of wanting. She made tea. She needed something to do with her hands. The ring was repaired by 10:45. Damien held it under a small clamp while the epoxy cured, and Marcus sat across from him and asked about the replacement acetate and whether the optical properties were the same as the original. And Damien said he genuinely didn't know, but the weight and thickness were close. And Marcus accepted this with the scientific rigor of someone who understood the difference between a known fact and a reasonable approximation. At 11, Marcus went to bed. He said goodnight to Damien with the specific casualness of someone who has decided something privately and isn't going to announce it. Claire poured tea she hadn't offered and put a mug in front of Damien, who had finally taken his coat off and was sitting at the kitchen table with the Saturn model between them, the clamp holding the ring steady. "You didn't have to do this," she said. She sat down across from him. "You asked," he said simply. "I know, but you—" She stopped, wrapped her hands around the mug. "I'm not good at asking for things. That took a lot for me." He looked at her, not with the soft, indulgent expression that people sometimes used with her, the expression that meant they found her hardship touching in a distant sort of way. Just looked at her steadily, like what she'd said was important and he was treating it as such. "I know it did," he said. "I want you to know I'm not going to be someone who calls you every time something breaks." "Claire." "I mean it. I handle things. I have always handled." "I know you handle things," he said. He wasn't cutting her off. His voice was even, direct, the way he got when he was saying something he'd thought about. "You've been handling things alone for years and you're exceptionally good at it. But you asked me for help tonight and I came. Those are both okay." She looked at the mug. "I spent a year after Kevin left not asking anyone for anything," she said. Kevin was the first time she'd used her ex-husband's name with Damien. She noticed that but didn't stop. Because I'd asked him for things, and he'd used it as evidence that I was too much work, so I stopped asking. She paused. Old habit. Damien didn't say anything for a moment. She felt the silence and waited for him to fill it with something. Reassurance, or the obligatory comment about what kind of person Kevin must be, or the reframe that turned her experience into something easier to hold. He didn't do any of those things. That makes sense, he said. The habit. I know it doesn't serve me. I didn't say it didn't serve you, he said. It probably kept you going for a long time. She looked up at him. I just mean, he turned the mug slightly on the table. Habits that kept you functional during something hard don't automatically become useless after. You figure out over time which ones still apply. A pause. I had some of those too. After Rachel. It was the most he'd said about Rachel since the parking lot in the fall when she'd understood, without being told, that there was a Rachel-shaped silence in his life. She didn't push, but she filed it. What was hers? She asked quietly. Habit that kept you going. He thought about it. Working, he said. I was already a person who worked too much, and after she died, I just went further in that direction. Poured everything into the company. Told myself I was building something for Sophie. A pause. Mostly I was just making sure I was too busy to sit in a quiet room. And now? I sit in more quiet rooms, he said. It's still not comfortable. He glanced toward the hallway where Marcus's room was. Sophie started asking me if I was going to be sad forever when she was 5. What did you tell her? I told her no. He looked back at Claire. I wasn't sure if it was true. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the Saturn model between them and Emma's dinosaur drawings on the wall above the refrigerator and the city quiet outside and Marcus's sneakers by the door, one untied, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the version with clean edges and perfect timing and a clear emotional arc. This version. Kitchen table, 10 p.m. Borrowed epoxy and old habits, and 2 people who'd both been through something and were both still figuring out what came next. I should let you get some sleep, Damien said, beginning to stand. The clamp needs to stay on until morning, she said. You'll want to check that before Marcus takes it to school. He stopped. You can sleep on the couch, she said. It's fine, it pulls out. He looked at her. I'm not... She felt the heat in her face. I just mean the project. I want you to check it before he takes it. I know what you meant, he said. He slept on the couch. She brought him a blanket and a pillow and felt profoundly awkward about it, in a way that she recognized as the specific awkwardness of someone who had been alone for long enough that having another adult in the apartment felt foreign. In the morning, Marcus found Damien awake before anyone else, checking the epoxy bond on the Saturn ring with the careful attention of someone who takes small things seriously. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas and watched him. Is it good? Marcus asked. Damien worked the clamp loose carefully, held the ring up to the morning light coming through the window, checked both sides of the bond. It's good, he said. Marcus came over and took the model, examined it himself. The ring was solid. You could barely see the repair line unless you knew where to look. Cool, Marcus said. He went back to his room to get dressed. Damien put the clamp back in the hardware bag. Claire was in the kitchen making coffee, her back to him, and she didn't turn around immediately when he came in. He sat at the table and waited. She turned and set a mug in front of him. Marcus got a 94 on his last quiz, she said. He was upset about it. Why? Wanted 100. Damien looked at the quiz on the refrigerator. He's going to be all right, he said. I know, she said. She sat down across from him. I know he is. They drank their coffee while the apartment came alive around them. Emma's feet on the floor overhead, the sound of Marcus's shower, the particular early morning sounds of a household starting its day. And it wasn't quiet exactly, but it was peaceful, and that was different. The thing about the weeks that followed was that they didn't announce themselves as anything. There was no moment where either of them said, this is what this is, or we are doing this now. It just kept happening. The texts, the coffees, the afternoon at the park, the night with the Saturn ring, and then more after that. A Saturday when Sophie and Emma spent 4 hours together, and Marcus showed Sophie how to find constellations on a star map, because Marcus had gotten a star map as an early Christmas present and needed an audience. An evening when Damien came to the school winter concert and stood in the back with Claire, and they watched Marcus play the triangle in the 4th grade percussion section with the absolute focused concentration of someone who had decided that the triangle was going to be played correctly, and Claire pressed her lips together to keep from laughing, and Damien had to look away for a second for the same reason. A Sunday afternoon when Damien was supposed to be reviewing site plans, and Sophie was supposed to be doing the reading she'd been putting off all week. And instead they were both at Claire's kitchen table because Emma had asked Sophie to come over and help her name a new set of plastic dinosaurs. And Sophie had agreed with the gravity of someone who understood the importance of the task, and somewhere in the course of the afternoon it had become a group project. "This one is a Brachiosaurus," Emma said, holding up a long-necked green figure. "I think that one is actually an Apatosaurus," Marcus said from the other side of the table where he was ostensibly doing homework. Emma looked at the dinosaur, then at Marcus. "His name is Gerald," she said. "The scientific classification, Gerald," Emma said firmly. Marcus opened his mouth, looked at Damien, who was watching with his chin resting on his hand and his site plans untouched beside him, and closed his mouth again. "Gerald," Marcus said. "Thank you," Emma said, and moved on to the next dinosaur. Sophie caught Damien's eye and gave him the look she used when something met her standards. He almost laughed. Claire came in from the kitchen with a plate of crackers and cheese, the kind of thing you put together when someone is at your house and you want to feed them without making it into a thing, and stopped in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the four of them at her kitchen table, her son reluctantly accepting the naming of Gerald, the technically not Brachiosaurus, her daughter holding court over a plastic herd of dinosaurs, Sophie Hayes conducting herself with enormous diplomatic seriousness, and Damien watching all of it with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a person who is somewhere they didn't fully expect to be and is realizing they don't want to leave. She knew the expression because she'd caught it on her own face twice in the past week, in the mirror when she wasn't expecting it. She put the crackers on the table and went back to the kitchen, and stood at the counter for a moment with her back to the room, listening to Emma argue with herself about whether a Triceratops should be named Brian or Svetlana, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel it. All of it. The warmth of it. The specific and frightening warmth of something growing in a place she'd been sure had stopped growing. She felt it, and she was afraid of it, and she didn't do anything about the fear, and she went back to the room. There were things she didn't tell him still. She didn't tell him about the month in January 2 years ago when she'd been 2 weeks behind on rent and had eaten peanut butter sandwiches for 8 straight days while making sure Marcus and Emma didn't notice anything was wrong. She didn't tell him about the way Kevin had left. Not just that he'd gone, but how he'd gone. The specific and methodical way he'd dismantled 4 years of a shared life, the way he'd said, near the end, that she was exhausting, in the tone people use when they want to make their leaving feel like your fault. She didn't tell him that she'd believed it for a while. She wasn't ready to. And something in the way Damien moved through her life, patient, unhurried, not pushing on the parts she'd closed off, made her feel like she had time to get there. What she did tell him, over coffee one Tuesday morning in late December, was this. Kevin came to see the kids last Easter. Damien was quiet, waiting. He showed up at my door with presents, told Marcus he'd been traveling for work, told Emma he missed her. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Emma didn't know him. She's only 4, right? She barely remembers him at all. She looked at him like he was a stranger, which, essentially, he is. She paused. Marcus knew who he was. He stood in the doorway and looked at his father for a long moment, and then he said, "We were eating lunch," and went back to the table. Damien didn't say anything. Kevin stood there for a minute, and then he left. She set the mug down. He hasn't come back since. The silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. "How was Marcus after?" Damien asked. It was the right question. Not "how were you?" Not "what a bastard?" Not the reframe or the reassurance. Just, "How was Marcus?" "Quiet for a day," she said. "Then fine." Or, "What looks like fine." "That's the age where they decide what they're going to do with things," Damien said. "Whether they're going to put it down or carry it." "Yeah," she looked at him. "How do you help them put it down?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if you help them exactly," he said. "I think you make sure they see you not carrying it. You model the putting down." She thought about that for a long time after he left, sitting in the coffee shop with her empty cup, watching the street outside fill up with lunch hour foot traffic, people in their winter coats moving fast against the cold. 2 days before Christmas, something shifted. She was working the evening shift, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., which was the hardest shift because the hospital got quieter, and the nights got long, and the tiredness became a specific, meditative kind of tired that sometimes made things clear and sometimes made them worse. She was doing rounds at 11 when one of the other nursing assistants, a woman named Priya, who had worked with her for 2 years, came up beside her in the hallway. "Somebody came and fixed the radiator in the east break room," Priya said. Claire looked at her. "What?" "Like someone called a repairman. It's been broken since September. We've been freezing in there for 4 months." Priya paused. "I asked the front desk. They said somebody filed a maintenance complaint directly with the hospital facilities board on behalf of the nursing staff, anonymously." Claire stood in the hallway. "That's weird, right?" Priya said. "Who does that?" Claire said nothing for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "Weird." She texted Damien at midnight from the break room in front of the radiator that was now working. "Did you file a maintenance complaint with Jefferson's facilities board about the East Wing break room?" The response came back 3 minutes later. "The nursing staff shouldn't be freezing in their break room. It's a basic working condition issue." She stared at the screen. She typed several responses and deleted them. She stared at the radiator. "You are so strange," she finally wrote. "Is the room warm?" She looked around the small break room, the table with the scratched surface, the old coffee maker, the chair with the broken armrest that someone had fixed with a zip tie, Priya's mug with the cartoon cat on it sitting in the drying rack. "Yes," she wrote. "Good." She put her phone in her pocket and sat down at the table in the warm room, and it was midnight at Jefferson Hospital, and she had 3 more hours on her shift and a calculus of daily life that hadn't changed at all since summer. And she felt, quietly and without making anything of it, that something had. She didn't examine it too closely. She just let it sit there, in the warm room, in the middle of the night, like something that belonged. Marcus's project came back 2 weeks into January with a note from his teacher that said, "Best black hole section I've seen in 10 years of teaching this grade. Well done." Claire put it on the refrigerator beside the 94, and when she texted Damien the photo, he sent back 3 words. "Told you so." She smiled at her phone in the hospital parking lot at 6:45 a.m., still in her scrubs, her car warming up in the January cold, and she smiled in the specific way of someone who has stopped fighting something they were never going to win. The planetarium had been Marcus's idea first, not in any grand sense. He'd mentioned it once in November, almost in passing, while he was explaining orbital mechanics to Damien at the park, gesturing at a sky that was too bright with city light to show him what he actually wanted to show him. "The Franklin Institute has a sky show on Saturdays," he'd said. "It's not the same as real dark sky, but it's better than nothing." And then he'd moved on to something else, the way 9-year-olds do, topic to topic, without ceremony, and Damien had filed it without comment. He took Marcus in February, on a Saturday when Claire was working, and Emma was with Claire's neighbor, the reliable Mrs. Okafor, who smelled like lavender and let Emma watch too much television, and whom Emma loved with a devotion she expressed by drawing her portraits of dinosaurs. Damien had texted Claire the morning before. "Can I take Marcus to the Franklin Institute tomorrow?" "The planetarium." She'd taken longer to respond than usual. When she did, it was, "You don't have to do that." He'd written back, "I know, can I take him?" Another pause, then, "He'll talk your ear off the entire time. I'm counting on it." She'd sent a thumbs up, and then, after a moment, "Thank you." Marcus, to his credit, did talk the entire time. Through the lobby, through the exhibits, through the 45-minute wait in the line that snaked around the main hall, pointing at things, asking questions of Damien, and occasionally of strangers near them who looked like they might know the answers. He was not a shy child, Damien had come to understand, just selective. He spent his energy on things that interested him, and the universe interested him enormously. In the dome of the planetarium, when the lights went down and the projected sky bloomed across the ceiling, the Milky Way in a sweep of cold white light, the constellations named and traced in slow gold lines, Marcus went completely quiet for the first time in 2 hours. He sat beside Damien with his chin tilted up and his hands flat on his knees, and he was just still. Just a 9-year-old kid looking at the stars. Damien looked at him, and then looked up at the ceiling himself. And in the dark and the quiet, he felt something simple. Something that had nothing to do with business or architecture or any of the things his brain was usually running in the background. Just the particular feeling of being somewhere that mattered, with someone who needed to be there. Afterward, in the museum cafe, Marcus ate a pretzel, and Damien drank bad coffee, and Marcus said, "My dad used to say he'd take me to places like this." Damien didn't react outwardly, just waited. "He never did," Marcus said. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without drama, but with the flatness of something that had been processed and reprocessed until the processing had become its own kind of weight. He said a lot of stuff he didn't do. Damien turned his coffee cup on the table. "Yeah," he said. "Is that why they—" Marcus stopped. "Did my mom tell you about my dad?" "Some," Damien said. Marcus thought about this. "He left when Emma was a baby," he said. "I was 6. I remember him, but it's like remembering a TV show, not like remembering a real person." Damien didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that wouldn't feel thin compared to what Marcus had just put on the table. "Does that make sense?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Damien said. It makes sense." Marcus ate the last of his pretzel. "Sophie said her mom died," he said carefully. "She did. 6 years ago." "That's different," Marcus said. It wasn't a judgment, just an observation, delivered with the precision Marcus applied to everything. Like, your wife didn't choose to leave. The directness of it would have knocked most adults sideways. Damien sat with it for a moment. "No," he said. "She didn't choose to." "Do you think that's harder or easier?" Marcus asked. And then immediately, "You don't have to answer that." Damien looked at him. This 9-year-old with bad coffee and a pretzel and a question about grief that most adults avoided for their entire lives. "I think they're just different kinds of hard," Damien said. "Your dad leaving means there's someone out there who made a choice. That's a different thing to carry than an accident." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I used to think he'd come back," he said. "When I was 7, I used to think he was just away for a while, like a business trip." A pause. "I don't think that anymore." "Good," Damien said, not harshly, just clearly. "Because waiting for someone to come back who decided to go it costs you things. Things you need." Marcus looked at him with his direct, measuring gaze. "Like what?" "Like the room you need to let the right people in," Damien said. It was quiet at the table for a moment. Marcus turned that over the way he turned things over, thoroughly, without rushing. "Okay," he said finally, and then picked up his napkin and wiped pretzel salt off his hands with the businesslike finality of someone who has reached a conclusion and is ready to move on. They took the subway home. Marcus fell asleep against the window somewhere between City Hall and Ellsworth Federal, his breath fogging the glass, his museum receipt sticking out of his coat pocket. Damien looked at him and felt something he didn't try to name. He just let it be what it was. By March, Damien had become a fixture in the particular ecosystem of Claire's daily life. Not constant, not intrusive, but present in the way that water is present, filling the shape of things around it without announcement. He knew Marcus's homework schedule and the specific pitch of Emma's pre-cry sound, and which of Claire's silences meant tired and which meant something else. He knew that Claire hated being handed things. She preferred to pick things up herself, a preference so ingrained she'd never noticed it until he had, quietly, and stopped handing her things. He knew that she read for 30 minutes before bed when she could, that she kept the television on low as background noise when she was cooking, that she checked the locks on the apartment door twice before she went to sleep. He knew these things not because she'd told him, but because he'd been paying attention. And paying attention was the thing he was best at. Claire, for her part, had started to let herself know things about him. That he was better at being present in a room than most people twice his age, but terrible at being present on the phone. He was always half somewhere else during calls, and she'd learned to say his name when she needed his full attention, which brought him back immediately and completely. That he carried Rachel in a way that was quiet and private and load-bearing. Not displayed, not performed, but structural. The way a load-bearing wall is structural. You could live in the house without thinking about it, and it was still holding everything up. That he was harder on himself than anyone she'd ever met. That he deflected this with practicality, with efficiency, with the forward motion of someone who believed the antidote to regret was doing the next right thing. She'd started letting him in, is what she'd started doing. Not all the way, but more. The first time she'd cried in front of him was in early March, not over anything large or dramatic, which somehow made it worse. She'd come home from a night shift to find that the water heater had gone out overnight, and the apartment was cold, and Emma had woken up to no hot water and was crying, and Marcus was trying to manage Emma while also making his own breakfast. And the landlord's phone went to voicemail, and Claire had been awake for 14 hours, and she walked into her kitchen and stood there looking at all of it, and just ran out of room. She'd called Damien because she couldn't call Diane at 6 a.m., and she couldn't call anyone from work because she'd spent 2 years being the person at work who handled things, and her hands were shaking slightly when she dialed. He answered on the second ring. "What's wrong?" She told him. She was not dramatic about it. The specifics, the water heater, the landlord, the kids. But her voice had the tight quality of someone operating at the edge of their capacity. And she was not, she realized partway through, going to be able to keep it together for the whole call. She didn't. It wasn't a full breakdown. 2 or 3 seconds where her voice broke and she stopped talking. She got it back quickly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm tired. I'm being—" "Don't," he said. His voice was steady. Not alarmed, not soft in the performative way. Just steady. "Don't apologize." She pressed her back against the kitchen wall. Marcus had gotten Emma settled with cereal and they were both at the table, Marcus pretending not to notice his mother on the phone, which was its own kind of grace. "I'll call a plumber," Damien said. "What's your landlord's name?" "You don't need to Claire, water heater, plumber. Landlord's name." She gave him the name. She heard him write it down. "I'll have someone there by 9, he said. "Take a hot shower at the gym on Broad. The Jefferson Rec Center has day passes. I'll text you the address. Take the kids with you if you need to. Damien, go sleep for 4 hours. I'll call you when it's handled." She stood in the kitchen for a moment, phone against her ear, looking at her 2 kids eating cereal at the kitchen table, Emma with a stegosaurus in her non-spoon hand because Emma could not eat without a dinosaur nearby, Marcus reading the back of the cereal box with the focused attention he applied to any available text. "Okay," she said quietly. The plumber was there at 8:45. The landlord received a phone call from Hayes Development Group's legal department, which Damien had not mentioned, but which became apparent when the landlord called Claire at noon to apologize personally and confirm that the repair costs were being absorbed by the building management, as per the lease clause that the legal team had apparently been kind enough to reference. The water heater was fixed and running by 2 p.m. She called Damien when she woke up. "The landlord called me," she said. "I heard. Your legal department called him." Patricia may have mentioned there was a maintenance issue at a residential property with known lease clause violations. "Damien, the clause was right there in your lease. He was already in violation." She sat on the edge of her bed, still in yesterday's clothes, hair in a mess, blinking in the afternoon light. "You read my lease?" A pause. "You sent it to me in October. When you were having the heat issue, you asked if I thought you had any standing." She had sent it to him. She'd forgotten. "You kept it," she said. "I keep things," he said, "in case they're useful." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and she ended up doing a small, exhausted version of both, quietly enough that he probably didn't hear it. "You need to stop doing things for me," she said. "Why?" "Because I can't." She stopped, tried again. "I don't know how to account for this. In my head, what you do, I don't know how to—" "You don't need to account for it," he said. "It's not a ledger." "Everyone's a ledger," she said. "That's what I've learned." He was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone." She pressed the phone against her ear and looked out the window of her bedroom. The narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings across the alley, gray and late winter cold. "I'm scared of you," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because she was tired and her guard was down, and it was true. "I know," he said. "That doesn't bother you?" "Should it?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "I guess it just means I'm paying attention." He didn't say anything to that. Just let it sit there. Which was, she thought, probably the right answer. Spring came incrementally, the way it did in Philadelphia. Not a transition so much as a series of small arguments the weather made with itself. 3 warm days and then a cold snap, the trees starting and stopping, the light shifting earlier degree by degree. The city exhaled. People came out of their coats and blinked in the new light like something returning to itself. The 4 of them went to the Franklin Institute together in April. All 4 of them, Damien and Sophie and Claire and the kids. A Saturday that had been organized around Emma demanding to see the dinosaur exhibit, and Marcus wanting to go back to the planetarium, and Sophie having no opinion except that she wanted to be wherever Emma was, which had become Sophie's general position on Emma. They were not a family, technically. Damien was careful about that word in his own head, careful about the weight of it, about the presumption. He and Claire had not said the word to each other. had not defined what they were in any formal sense. There was a physical dimension now, tentative, careful, nothing that happened in front of the children, and there was the text thread that never fully went dark, and the coffees and the dinners and the evenings at her kitchen table. There was something real. But neither of them had put a name to it out loud, and he wasn't pushing. But walking through the museum with Sophie on his left and Emma on his right, and Marcus a half step ahead, pointing at things with the authority of someone who had already been here once, and now considered himself a guide, and Claire beside him, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her shoulder 2 inches from his. Walking through all of that, Damien felt something straighten in him, some crooked thing going incrementally less crooked. Marcus had appointed himself Emma's dinosaur docent and was explaining, with enormous patience, the difference between the Cretaceous and Jurassic periods to a 4-year-old who was mostly interested in which ones were biggest. Sophie was contributing occasional supporting facts she'd clearly just looked up on Damien's phone, which she had borrowed and was now using as a reference tool. Emma was listening to all of it with the solemn attention she gave to subjects she cared about, which meant dinosaurs, and also Gerald, and also Sophie. "This one is bigger than a house," Marcus said, pointing at the T-Rex replica. "Gerald could fight it," Emma said. "Gerald is a plastic toy," Marcus said. "Gerald is brave," Emma said. Sophie looked at Damien. He looked back at her. She pressed her lips together. He looked away. Claire was watching all 4 of them and doing the things she did sometimes. Just watching, not talking, present in the way that people are present when they're saving something for later. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Nothing profound," she said. "I was thinking Marcus needs a haircut." He smiled. "Don't read into it," she said. "I'm not reading into anything." She looked at him sideways. "You're reading into it a little. You said Marcus needs a haircut. I believe you." She almost laughed. Almost. She did the thing where she controlled it at the last moment, and he watched her control it, and something in him ached in a way that felt more like warmth than pain. The evening of the museum day, after the kids were in bed and Sophie was asleep on the pull-out couch in Claire's living room because the day had run long and everyone had agreed it was easier and Sophie had wanted to stay, Damien and Claire sat at the kitchen table again. It was their place, the kitchen table, the site of the Saturn ring and the 6 a.m. coffee and 100 smaller things. He had the particular feeling of a table that had absorbed things. "I want to tell you something," Claire said. She was holding her tea mug. She looked at it rather than at him for a moment, which was how she started things she'd been composing in her head. "Okay," he said. "Kevin, when he left, the way he left." She set the mug down, flat hands on either side of it. He didn't just walk out. He'd been planning it for about 4 months. I found out later that he'd moved money into a separate account, paid a deposit on an apartment. He had a whole parallel life going while I was pregnant with Emma and after Emma was born, and I didn't know any of it. Was Tom Swandigand? She paused. When I found out, I thought about all the times I thought something was off, and I'd believed him when he said it was work stress, and I felt stupid for believing him. Damien said nothing. And then I spent a long time after that, a long time, not trusting my own read on people, because I'd been so wrong about him. She looked up. "So when you—" She stopped. "I want you to know that the being scared is not about you, specifically. It's about me not trusting myself anymore." He held her gaze. "Do you trust yourself now?" She thought about it honestly. "More than I did," she said. "I trust my read on you, which is—" A pause. "Which is actually terrifying because trusting it means I have something to lose." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatic, just placed it there on top of her flat hands, which immediately turned over and held on. "I'm not planning anything I'm not telling you," he said. "I've never been good at lying, and I'm worse at it now than I used to be." A pause. "Sophie would tell on me anyway." She did laugh this time, fully for a second before she caught it. "Sophie would absolutely tell on you." "She told me last week that I look happier," he said. "She said it like she was filing a report." Claire's expression softened. She's remarkable, Damien. She's Rachel's," he said. "The best parts of her." Claire looked at him. What was Rachel like? He hadn't talked about Rachel, not really, not in the full sentence, past tense, here is who she was way. He'd circled around her. She'd let him. But it was almost midnight in the kitchen, and the kids were asleep, and something had opened up. She was impatient, he said. Like genuinely impatient. She hated waiting for anything. Lines, traffic, people who talked around the point instead of getting to it. He paused. She made me faster at everything. I was always a deliberate person, and she pushed me to move quicker, decide faster. It was good for me. He turned his coffee cup. She was kind in a way that wasn't soft. She could tell you a hard truth and you'd walk away grateful for it. Sophie got that. You talk about her like she was a whole person, Claire said. He looked up. What? A lot of people, when they talk about someone they've lost, they flatten them, make them perfect, make them a symbol. She shook her head. You said she was impatient. You said she pushed you. It's like she still... She paused. You kept her real. Something moved through him, quiet and significant. I've worked at that, he said. Sophie needs to know who her mother actually was. Not a saint. A person. Claire looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Marcus and Emma need to know that their father is just a person who failed them. Not a monster. Not an absence that defines them. Just a person who made bad choices. She paused. I'm still working at that. It's harder, he said. He's still alive. Still out there making choices. Yeah, she said. They sat with that for a while. Then Claire said, I should go to bed. Yeah, he said. Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. July was the month things broke open. Not in a dramatic single-moment way, more like the way a riverbank gives way after a long rain, incrementally and then all at once. The relationship had a name by then, technically, in the sense that they'd set us to other people and we without self-consciousness, and the children had absorbed this information with varying degrees of expressed interest. Sophie had said, when Damien told her, finally, in a tone that suggested she'd been waiting for the official announcement for some time. Marcus had nodded with the gravity of someone ratifying a treaty. Emma had asked if it meant Sophie could come over more, and when Damien said yes, she had returned to Gerald. What happened in July started with Claire's car. The electrical tape had been losing the fight with the cracked mirror for months, and in mid-July the mirror finally gave up entirely, and the driver's side power window stopped working, and a noise started in the engine that the mechanic described with the particular expression mechanics use when they're deciding how to tell you the number. She called Damien at 8 p.m. from the mechanic's parking lot. The mechanic says it's the timing chain, she said, and the mirror and the window. The number is... She stopped, said the number. He was quiet for a second. I can't pay that right now, she said. It came out flat and clear, no apology in it. She'd gotten better at that. I don't have it. Okay, he said. I have two options. I take the bus for the next 3 weeks while I save up, or I put it on the credit card and manage the payment. A pause. I'm not asking you to... I know you're not, he said, but I'm going to offer anyway, and you can tell me no. She was quiet. Let me cover the repair, he said. Not as a thing you owe me. Not as a ledger. Just as something I can do that makes your life easier, and that I want to do. Damien, you've let me fix things before, he said. The water heater. The Saturn ring. Those were different. Were they? She sat in the mechanic's parking lot in the July heat and looked at the car through the shop window, the hood up, the mechanic's legs sticking out from underneath it. She thought about the bus schedule and the school run and the hospital shifts and all the arithmetic she did so automatically she no longer experienced it as math. It's too much, she said. It's not, he said. It feels like too much. I know it does, he said. That's not the same as it being too much. She pressed her palm against the warm roof of the car. I don't want to be someone you take care of, she said. I've been very careful not to be that person. You're not, he said. You're someone I love who needs her car fixed. The mechanic's parking lot was very quiet for a moment. They hadn't said that word. Not like that. Not directly. Without softening. Without the specific uncertainty that had surrounded every conversation that touched it. What did you just say? She said. He said it again, clearly and without drama. You're someone I love who needs her car fixed. She stood in the parking lot and felt the word settle through her. Not the word itself, but the delivery of it, the plainness of it, the way it didn't ask anything of her, didn't come attached to a requirement or a trade. Just information, just true. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady, but only technically. Okay. Is that? Yes, she said. That's... Yes. She heard him exhale. Good, he said. Tell the mechanic I'll call with a card. She almost laughed. You are so strange. I love you, he said again. And your car needs a timing chain. She put her hand over her mouth for a second. In the parking lot. In July. In the heat. I love you too, she said. You impossible person. The timing chain was fixed by Tuesday. The next shift, though, happened in the way Damien hadn't anticipated. At 10:37 p.m. on a Saturday in September, in Claire's apartment, during the first overnight he'd spent there while Claire was working. It was not the first time he'd been with the kids while she worked. That had happened twice before, in carefully staged increments, tested first with 2 hours, then 4, building toward the longer stretch. This was the first full overnight. Claire had a double shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Margaret, Damien's housekeeper, who had known Sophie since she was a baby and was one of the few people Damien trusted entirely, was with Sophie at his place across the city. He'd put Emma to bed at 8:30 after 2 dinosaur stories and the specific negotiation over which stuffed animals were permitted in the bed, which was a negotiation Emma conducted with the patience and strategic patience of a 4-year-old who had done this before and knew that the end result was always more animals than the initial offer. She'd fallen asleep with Gerald on her pillow and a brachiosaurus, not Gerald, a different one, whose name was Linda, tucked under her arm. Marcus had stayed up until 9:30, ostensibly finishing homework, actually spending 20 minutes of it asking Damien questions about Hayes Development's project process, which Damien had answered in full because Marcus asked good questions and deserved full answers. At 9:30, Marcus had closed his notebook and said he was going to bed, and had paused in the doorway of the living room. Damien, he'd said. Yeah. Is my mom... He'd stopped, started differently. Is she okay? Is she happy? Damien had looked at him, knowing that the question had layers, knowing it was about more than happiness in the daily sense, that it was the question of a child who had watched his mother manage and endure and carry for years, and was asking whether something had changed. Yes, he said. I think so. Marcus had looked at him for a moment with those eyes that processed everything. She laughs more, he said. Since you... He stopped again, settled for... She laughs more. I know, Damien said. Marcus nodded. Okay, he said, and went to bed. Damien sat in Claire's living room after both kids were down. A small room with furniture that had been chosen practically rather than aesthetically, the couch slightly worn on the left arm where Claire habitually sat, a lamp with a crooked shade, Marcus's science projects from the last 3 months stacked on the shelf because Claire never took them down, Emma's drawings on every vertical surface, including the inside of the bathroom door. He sat in the room that contained the evidence of this family, and he felt the full weight of being in it. Not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who was present in it and mattered to the people in it, and that was something he had not let himself be in a very long time. He sat with that. At 10:37, he heard bare feet on the floor in the hallway. Marcus appeared in the doorway in pajamas, not Emma. Marcus, older, more contained, the one who didn't pad out in the night for water. Damien sat up. Hey, what's wrong? Marcus came into the living room and sat in the armchair across from the couch, with the deliberate movement of someone who had decided to do something and was going to do it. He didn't look sleepy. He'd clearly been lying awake. I have a question, Marcus said. Okay. Marcus looked at him, straight, clear, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand fully. Are you going to disappear too? The words were quiet, simple, and they hit Damien somewhere in the center of his chest with a force entirely disproportionate to their volume. He didn't answer immediately. He held the question, the whole weight of it, everything behind it. The 6-year-old who'd watched his father leave, the 9-year-old who had decided to keep the distance, the boy who had accepted the poster board and the epoxy and the planetarium and the Saturday at the museum but had kept somewhere a room locked. No, Damien said. Marcus looked at him. I'm not going to disappear, Damien said. I know that's what he did. I know you've been watching for it. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't... You were, Damien said gently. You should have been. It was smart. The boy went still. I can't tell you every detail of the future, Damien said. I've lived long enough to know that doesn't work. But I can tell you what I intend. And what I intend is to be here. He paused. Not because your mom needs someone, because I want to be, because you're. He stopped, found the true thing, and said it. Because you and Emma are already part of how I think about my life. That happened. I'm not going to walk away from that. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. His face was doing several things at once. The careful assessment, the old protection, and underneath it, something cracking. Emma asks about you when you're not here, he said. He said it like it was a fact he was reporting, not an appeal. She says, "Where's Damien when you don't come over?" I know, Damien said. Sophie does the same thing about Emma. Marcus was quiet. He looked at his hands, then back up. My dad used to tuck me in, Marcus said, before he left. And then one day he just didn't. And I kept waiting for him to come back in and do it, and he didn't. And then after a while I stopped waiting. A pause. I don't want Emma to stop waiting for something that's actually there. Damien looked at this 9-year-old, this boy who had been managing his expectations and protecting his sisters for 2 years, and who had come out in the dark tonight to ask the question because someone had to ask it. Marcus, he said, I hear you. Marcus looked up. She doesn't have to stop waiting, Damien said. Neither do you. It was very quiet in the apartment. The city was doing its usual low nighttime noise, a car somewhere, the distant rhythm of something, the building settling. Marcus stood up after a while. He went back to the doorway. Then he stopped and turned around. She's going to be scared, he said. My mom. She's going to try to talk herself out of it. I know, Damien said. Don't let her, Marcus said. Damien looked at him. She does that, Marcus said. When something good happens, she looks for the reason it's going to go wrong. She's been doing it for a long time. He paused. Someone should tell her it's okay to stop. Then he went back to bed. Damien sat in the quiet living room for a long time afterward, in Claire's apartment with its crooked lamp and its worn couch arm, and the evidence of her life on every wall. And he felt something settle in him that he recognized as a decision. Not the kind that gets made in board meetings, not the practical, strategic decisions that his career was built on. The other kind. The kind that happens when something already true finally becomes loud enough to acknowledge. He loved this woman. He loved her children. He had no idea how to do what came next with any kind of elegance, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But he was going to do it. Claire came home at 7:15 a.m., let herself in quietly, and found Damien asleep on the couch with Gerald the dinosaur, which Emma had apparently given him at some point in the night, sitting on the armrest beside him. She stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment, still in her scrubs, and looked at him sleeping there in her apartment with her daughter's plastic dinosaur as his only companion, and she felt something so full it was almost painful. She didn't wake him. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and when she came back he was awake, sitting up, blinking, running a hand through his hair. Good shift? He said. Long, she said. She handed him a cup, sat beside him on the couch. Marcus came out last night, Damien said. Around 10:30. She looked at him quickly. He asked if I was going to disappear, Damien said. She closed her eyes for a second. He asked me not to, he said. In his own way. He paused. I told him I wasn't. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and all the things she kept behind the careful management and the flat hands on tables were right there on her face, visible, uncurated. Damien, she said. I know, he said. I know. She put her coffee cup down on the table and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, not crying, just holding something, feeling it. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they sat on the couch in the early September morning while the apartment was quiet and the city woke up outside, and neither of them said anything for a while. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The proposal happened at the Franklin Institute on a Saturday in November, 14 months after the night in the hospital waiting room. Not because it was planned with the precision of a production. Damien had spent 3 weeks thinking about how and where and kept discarding the obvious answers. Not a restaurant. Not a penthouse. Not anywhere that looked like a page from a magazine, because Claire would have been uncomfortable, and her discomfort would have made him clumsy and the whole thing would have landed sideways. He'd wanted something real, something that meant something to the people in the room, rather than something that photographed well. Marcus had told him, in the car after the planetarium in February, that he came to the Franklin Institute most Saturdays when Claire was working, that Mrs. Okafor would bring him on the bus and let him wander the astronomy section for 2 hours while she read in the lobby cafe. He'd said it the way he said most things, without ceremony, just information. But Damien had filed it, the way he filed things about the people who mattered to him. He told Claire he wanted to take everyone to the Institute again. She hadn't questioned it. They'd been 3 times now as a group, and the kids treated it like a home base. She'd said, sure, give me 20 minutes to get Emma into shoes, which was always the project. He'd arranged it with Marcus 3 days before. Texted him privately, something they'd started doing occasionally. A thread separate from Claire, which had begun when Damien needed to know Emma's current dinosaur preferences before a birthday, and had evolved into something Marcus used to send him articles about things he was reading, usually astrophysics, sometimes history, once a deeply alarming piece about invasive species that Damien suspected was Marcus's way of testing whether he actually read what was sent. He always read it. I'm going to ask your mom something at the Institute on Saturday, Damien had written. I wanted to tell you first. Marcus had taken 40 minutes to respond. I know, he'd written back. Sophie told Emma, and Emma told me. Damien had stared at his phone. Sophie knows? Sophie figured it out. She said you've been weird for 3 weeks. He'd thought about that. Is weird good or bad? She says good weird. She says you keep looking at the ring box. He'd bought the ring 6 weeks ago and put it in his desk drawer and apparently been entirely unsuccessful at behaving normally about it. Is that okay? He'd typed. Me asking her? The response had come back in 5 minutes this time. She's going to say yes, Marcus had written. And then she's going to be scared. Don't let her talk herself out of it. The same thing he'd said in September in the dark. Don't let her. I won't, Damien had written. Okay, Marcus had written. And then after a pause, good. They'd arrived at the Franklin Institute at 2 in the afternoon on a gray November Saturday. All 4 of them plus Sophie, who had been with Damien for the weekend and who was conducting herself with the elaborate casualness of someone who knew what was coming and was working very hard not to telegraph it. Emma had Gerald in her coat pocket. Marcus had his hands in his pockets and was watching the sky through the glass entrance wall, which was what he did when he was thinking about something and didn't want to show it. Claire was reading a plaque near the entrance about the history of the building, because Claire read every plaque in every building she entered, a habit she'd told him came from her mother, who'd believed that buildings were worth knowing. The planetarium show was at 3. They had an hour before it, and they wandered the exhibits. Sophie and Emma in the space section, Emma narrating to Gerald about which planets were which, Sophie correcting her gently, Emma ignoring the corrections. Marcus drifted between them and the astronomy wing, one eye always on the door to the planetarium, managing the countdown. Damien walked with Claire. She was looking at a display about deep space photography, actual photographs taken by orbital telescopes, the ones where galaxies showed up as soft spirals of light against the absolute dark. And she was doing the thing she did with things that moved her, which was going very quiet and tilting her head slightly, like she needed a different angle to take it in fully. It's so much, she said, half to herself. Every time I see pictures like these, I think, there's so much out there. And we're so... She stopped. Small, Damien said. I was going to say busy, she said. We're so busy. We spend all this time being busy, and there's just... She gestured at the photograph. The spiral arm of a galaxy, 200 million light years away, rendered in blue and gold. All of this. He looked at the side of her face, the way her eyes moved across the photograph, seriously, fully, the way she looked at everything she decided was worth looking at. Claire, he said. She turned. He had not planned what to say exactly. He'd thought about it, and every version he'd rehearsed had sounded like something from a movie, which wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was to say the true thing plainly. I had a thing planned, he said, for inside the planetarium. I talked to Marcus about it, and there was a moment in the show where the lights go all the way down, and I thought... He stopped. And then you were standing here looking at a picture of a galaxy and saying we were too busy and I can't wait. She stared at him. He reached into his coat pocket. The ring box was small. He'd chosen deliberately, not a declaration of wealth, but something real, a round stone in a simple platinum setting that looked like it belonged on a hand that worked. He'd gone to 3 jewelers before he found the right one, and the jeweler, an older woman who had the specific patience of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, had said, "You'll know it when you see it for her." He had. He didn't go down on one knee because the floor of the Franklin Institute was tile and crowded, and he was 40% sure it would come out ungainly and because Claire was not a person who needed the theater. He held the box in his hand, open, and looked at her. "You told me on our first dinner that I should feel free to walk away," he said, "because you had 2 kids and a complicated life, and you expected me to take the exit, and I asked to see their pictures instead." He paused. "I'd ask to see their pictures again, 100 times. I'd go back to that dinner and make the same choice every single time." Another pause. "I want to make it official. All of it. You, Marcus, Emma. I want it to be mine if you'll let it." Claire was looking at him with the expression she got when she was running out of room for things, when the thing in front of her was too large for the careful management that usually contained everything. Her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set, and she was breathing slightly wrong. "You are—" She stopped. "I'm asking," he said. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, then at him, then at the ring. "I have 2 kids," she said. "I know. I was there when you mentioned it, multiple times. And a car that's 2 timing chains away from not being a car anymore." "The timing chain is fixed," he said. "We addressed that." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were doing something. "Marcus knew you were going to do this," she said. "Marcus told me Sophie told Emma, who told Marcus. So there was a full intelligence operation running that I had no control over." She actually laughed at that. A real one, startled out of her, her hand going to her mouth. And then she was crying, which happened approximately 1 second after the laugh, the way it sometimes does when something hits you in both places at once. "Stop," she said to herself, pressing her fingers under her eyes. "Stop it." "Take your time," he said. I'm not crying because I'm sad," she said, which he knew. "I'm crying because—" She gestured at him, and at the ring, and at the space between them, and at the galaxy photograph on the wall, and at the general situation. "All of this." "I know," he said. She looked at him. Her hands were doing the flat on a surface thing, except there was no surface, so she pressed them against the sides of her coat, and then she reached out and put one of them on his chest, over his sternum, and left it there. "Yes," she said. It came out quietly. Not performed, not risen to, just placed there between them like something that had always been true and was now being said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which he'd arranged through the improbable channel of borrowing one of her rings from her jewelry box 3 weeks ago, measuring it and returning it before she noticed, a operation Marcus had assisted with by keeping Claire occupied with a homework question in the other room, which Damien had only learned about afterward. "I had help," he said. She was looking at the ring on her hand with the expression of someone who is doing the inventory of their own life and finding something they hadn't expected. "I know you did," she said. 40 feet away, behind a display about the asteroid belt, Sophie and Marcus and Emma were watching with the specific intensity of people who have been told to look casual and are failing completely. Emma was holding Gerald up so he could see. Marcus had his arms crossed and his expression even, but his eyes were bright. Sophie had both hands over her mouth. Claire saw them. She waved at them. Sophie made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh and took off running toward them, because Sophie at 8 years old was incapable of handling large emotions at a walking pace. Emma took off after Sophie, which was Emma's general approach to Sophie's movements. Marcus walked. He came to where they were standing, looked at the ring, looked at Damien, looked at his mother. "I told you," he said to Damien. "You did," Damien said. Marcus looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and hugged her. The specific, slightly stiff way Marcus hugged, arms tight and brief and completely genuine. And Claire held him with one hand and pressed her face against his hair for a second. "You okay?" she asked him quietly. "Yeah," he said, into her shoulder. "I'm good." Emma hit them from the side like a small missile. And then Sophie arrived, and there was a tangle of people in front of a deep space photograph, and Damien stood back from it for 1 second, just one, to see all of it clearly before it moved. Then Sophie grabbed his arm and pulled him in. The months between the proposal and the wedding were not uncomplicated because nothing about the lives involved was uncomplicated. And anyone who thought that love resolved the practical and emotional arithmetic of 2 families being built into one had clearly never tried it. Claire's relationship with the idea of the wedding was fraught from the beginning. Not with Damien, with the concept. With the thing that a wedding meant, which was standing in front of people and saying, "This is real, and I believe it will hold," when every experience she had was of things she'd believed in failing. She'd had a wedding before. She'd stood in a different kind of room in a white dress with Kevin, and she'd meant every word, and so, she'd believed, had he. And then he'd spent 4 years dismantling it piece by piece, and she'd spent 2 years picking herself back up. And now she was supposed to do the dress, and the room, and the words again. She told Damien this on a Tuesday night in January in the kitchen, hands flat on the table. "I want to marry you," she said clearly. I'm not having second thoughts about you. I want you to know that before I say the other thing." "Okay," he said. "The wedding is making me, She pressed her lips together. "Every time we look at venues or talk to caterers or any of it, I feel like I'm building something that could fall down. And I know that's not rational, and I know it's history and not prediction, but my body doesn't know the difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then let's make it smaller," he said. "Whatever size it needs to be to feel like ours and not like a performance. Your board members are going to expect—" "My board members can come to the reception," he said. "The ceremony is ours." She looked at him. "Whatever you need," he said. "We do it that way. The church, the courthouse, the backyard. I don't care. I care about the end result. You can have the process." She'd cried again, which she was still slightly mortified about every time it happened. And he'd handed her a paper towel because they were in the kitchen and there were no tissues, which was so specific and unromantic and exactly right that she'd laughed while crying, which was undignified. But there it was. They settled on small, a venue in Old City, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and good light that held 80 people comfortably and didn't feel like a hotel ballroom. A ceremony in the early afternoon followed by dinner. People who mattered, not people who needed to be there for optics. Patricia, Damien's assistant, handled the logistics with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to make the decisions that didn't need to be made by the couple. And she did it without drama or opinion, which was why she'd worked for Damien for 5 years and would work for him for 10 more. Sophie had appointed herself the flower situation, a title she'd invented herself, which apparently meant she had opinions about what flowers were at the ceremony and where they went, and she exercised this role with the seriousness of a small general. Claire had let her have it completely, partly because Sophie's taste turned out to be good, and partly because the look on Sophie's face when she was making decisions about flowers was something Claire had come to love in a specific and private way. Marcus was going to stand with Damien, which had been Marcus's offer, and which Damien had accepted without making it into a moment. Just said, "Yeah, I'd like that," in the same tone he used for most things, practical and genuine. And Marcus had nodded and returned to whatever he was doing with the complete composure of a 10-year-old who had just done something significant and chosen not to acknowledge it. Emma was going to walk with Sophie, which Emma had determined herself on the grounds that Sophie was her best friend, and also because Sophie had promised to hold Gerald for her if she got tired. The week before the wedding, Claire fell apart. It happened on a Thursday night, 6 days before the Saturday ceremony, and it happened in the most ordinary possible way. She'd been fine all week, busy, yes, with last-minute things, but functional, moving forward. And then she was in the bathroom of the apartment she was still living in with the kids, the apartment that in 3 weeks they'd be moving out of when they moved into Damien's house. And she looked at herself in the mirror and she heard Kevin's voice, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, saying what he'd said in the end, that she was exhausting, that she wanted too much, that whoever came next would eventually figure that out. She sat down on the bathroom floor because her legs stopped cooperating. She sat there for a while. The tile was cold. The bathroom light was the specific harsh fluorescent of cheap rental apartments, the kind that showed everything. She looked at herself in the mirror from the floor. The angle made her look small, which she supposed was accurate, and she let the old voice run. She was doing this wrong. She was going to wreck it. She always thought things were real until they weren't. She'd believed Kevin, too. She'd believed in the wedding dress once before, and look how that had ended. Look where she'd washed up. Bathroom floor, cheap light, all the dignity she'd built by herself standing precarious on 2 years of not asking for help, and still here she was. She sat there until she heard a knock on the bathroom door. "Mom?" Marcus's voice, quiet. She looked at the door. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out wrong. A pause. Then, "I can hear you breathing." She pressed her fingers against her mouth. "Mom," Marcus said. Not a question, just her name. She got up off the floor and opened the door. Marcus was standing in the hallway in his pajamas, 10 years old, looking at her with the expression he'd had at 9 in the planetarium cafe. The one that was too old for his face and also completely his own. What happened? He said. Nothing happened. I just, She leaned against the doorframe. I got scared. Of what? She looked at her son. She thought about the thing Damien had said about Rachel, that he kept her real for Sophie, that he told Sophie who Rachel actually was rather than making her perfect. She thought about what it meant to be real in front of your child. I got scared that it's going to go wrong, she said. The wedding, all of it. Why would it go wrong? Because it went wrong before, she said. Because I thought I knew, and I was wrong. Marcus looked at her with the specific, unflinching patience he used when he was thinking through something from first principles. That was Kevin, he said. I know. This is Damien, Marcus said, like the distinction was that simple. And in his voice, it was. I know, she said again. Mom. He crossed his arms, his default posture when he was about to say something he'd thought about. Kevin left when I was 6, and I know what he was like before he left because I remember some of it. The way he was around, and then less around, and then gone. A pause. Damien has been here for a year, and he's gotten more here, not less. That's different. She looked at her son. He shows up, Marcus said, every time. He showed up with epoxy at 10 p.m. He showed up when your landlord was being a... He stopped himself. When you had the heat problem. He fixed the car. He came to the school play. He paused. He was there when Emma had the ear infection at 2 a.m. and you were at work. He stayed. She pressed her hand against the doorframe. I was there too, Marcus said quietly. That night. I heard him in the kitchen getting Emma's medicine and telling her it was going to feel better, and she called him Damien, and then she called him Dad, and he didn't... He stopped. His jaw worked. He didn't make it into a thing. He just said okay and kept going, like it was normal. Claire's eyes stung. That's what a person who's going to stay looks like, Marcus said. That's how I know. She looked at her 10-year-old son, standing in the hallway in his pajamas, who had watched and calculated and measured for a year with the instruments only a child can use, constant proximity, no agenda, pure observation, and had arrived at this conclusion. Come here, she said. He came and let her hug him properly, both arms, longer than he usually tolerated. He didn't pull away. You're going to be okay, Mom, he said into her shoulder. You're allowed to be happy. She held her son in the hallway outside the bathroom with the cold tile and the bad light, and she cried in the messy, uncoordinated way that happened when you'd been holding something for too long. She called Damien at 11:30 after Marcus was back in bed. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake. Hey, he said. What's going on? I need you to tell me something true, she said. A pause. What do you need? She sat on the couch in the dark living room, Emma's dinosaur drawings on the wall above the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway, the evidence of all of it around her. Tell me it's real, she said. Tell me I'm not... She couldn't finish it. It's real, he said. His voice was steady and unequivocal. It's the most real thing in my life since Sophie was born. She pressed her free hand against her knee. You're not getting it wrong, he said. You're not too much. You're not exhausting. You are the clearest thing I've looked at in 6 years, and I have looked at a lot of things. A pause. Kevin was wrong about you. He was wrong the whole time. She breathed. I'm going to be there Saturday, he said. Marcus and Emma and Sophie are going to be there. And when you walk down that aisle, you're going to see all of us, and it's going to be real. He paused. Okay, she said. Her voice was thick, but it was hers. Claire? Yeah. Go to sleep. You too. She did. The morning of the wedding, she got up at 6 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table by herself for 20 minutes before anyone else woke up. She sat with both hands around the mug and looked at the dinosaur drawings and the 94 quiz that was still on the refrigerator beside 2 more since then. An 88 that Marcus had been frustrated about, and a 97 that had made him cautiously satisfied. And the photo of the 4 of them at the Franklin Institute that she'd had printed and stuck to the fridge beside the quizzes because it was hers, and she wanted it where she could see it. She looked at the ring on her hand. She was afraid. That was still true. She didn't know how to make it not true, and she'd stopped trying. Fear wasn't the same as wrong. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it before, that the presence of fear was not evidence of a mistake. Sometimes fear was just what it felt like to want something and have something to lose. Diane arrived at 8 to help with the morning, which meant mostly managing Emma's accessories situation, which Emma had strong opinions about, most of them dinosaur adjacent. Emma had been told she couldn't carry Gerald down the aisle. She had accepted this and found a workaround, which was that Sophie would carry Gerald in her bouquet. Sophie had agreed immediately and without apparent conflict about this modification to her role as flower situation manager. Marcus got dressed in his suit with a focused efficiency that made him look older than 10, and then stood in the kitchen looking slightly stiff until Claire told him to go sit down and read something, and the stiffness left him entirely. The venue was 30 minutes away. Diane drove because Claire's hands weren't fully steady, a fact she acknowledged to Diane and to no one else. In the back of the car, Emma fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder almost immediately, which was Emma's response to formal events and also to most events. Marcus led her, which was Marcus's response to Emma. The venue was already set up when they arrived. The flowers Sophie had selected arranged along the aisle in a way that was simple and good, the light coming through the industrial windows at the angle that made the exposed brick warm. Patricia had done everything correctly, as Patricia did, and had left a small note on the table in the bridal room that said only, "Everything is ready," which was all Claire needed to know. She was fine through the hair and the makeup, and Diane's running commentary on both, fine through Emma insisting on wearing her dinosaur beret, which they'd agreed to, fine through Marcus adjusting his tie 3 times in the mirror with a precision that was entirely his own. Then she was in the bathroom. Not the fall-apart kind of being in the bathroom. Just standing there in the dress, looking at herself. The dress was ivory, not white, not the dress from the first wedding, nothing like it. She'd chosen it herself in a shop on Chestnut Street on a Tuesday in September, alone, which had been the right way to do it. It was plain and well cut, and it fit her exactly as she was, rather than as an idea of who a bride should be. She had the ring on her left hand and earrings that had been her mother's and her own face, looking back at her. The voices started. The old ones, the ones that sounded like Kevin, and also like the worst version of herself, the versions that had taken 2 years to quiet down and never fully went away. You don't get this. This isn't for people like you. You're a nursing assistant from Allentown with a cracked mirror on her car and 2 kids from a failed marriage, and eventually he's going to wake up and see that. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked at the ring. A small knock on the bathroom door. "Mom, Marcus's voice. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I just—" A pause. "Can I come in?" She opened the door. He was in his suit, tie finally correctly adjusted, looking up at her with the expression she knew best on him. The full, unguarded, 10-year-old version of his face that she didn't see as often as she used to, because he was growing into something more contained. He looked at her. He saw everything. He had always seen everything. "You look like Mom," he said. Not like a bride, not like you look beautiful, though both were also true. "You look like Mom, like himself, like home." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He stepped forward and put his arms around her, his chin at her collarbone because he was still 3 inches shorter than her, his grip tight and complete. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said. "He really loves us." She held her son. The words settled through her. He really loves us. Not he loves you or you'll be fine, but us, the full count, all 3 of them, the version of the truth that mattered most. "I know," she said. "I know he does." "So stop crying," Marcus said, against her shoulder. She almost laughed. "I'm crying because I'm happy." "That's a strange way to be happy." "You'll understand when you're older." "People keep saying that," he said, but he didn't let go. They stood there for another minute in the small bathroom of the venue, the 10-year-old and his mother in her wedding dress, holding on to each other before the next thing started. Then Emma appeared in the doorway in her flower girl dress, with Gerald in her hand, because Sophie was holding Gerald in the bouquet. But Emma had apparently negotiated a brief visit first, her hair half done, one shoe on. "Why are we standing here?" Emma asked. "We're getting ready," Marcus said, releasing Claire and standing up straight. "I'm ready," Emma said, holding up Gerald. "Where's your other shoe?" Claire asked. Emma looked at her feet, looked up. "Sophie has it." "Why does Sophie have your shoe?" Emma appeared to think about this. "She's holding things," she said, as if this was a complete explanation. Claire looked at her daughter, her impossible, dinosaur-obsessed, fearless 4-year-old daughter who had been born into chaos and had never once seemed to notice. "Okay," Claire said, and straightened up. "Let's go find your shoe." They walked down the aisle 20 minutes later. Claire had Marcus on her left and Emma on her right. Emma's second shoe successfully located and installed, Gerald having been transferred to Sophie's bouquet as previously arranged. The room had 80 people in it, most of whom Claire knew, and all of whom were looking at her, which would have been the thing she dreaded most about this day in any earlier version of herself. She looked at the altar. Damien was standing there in a dark suit that he wore the way he wore everything, without particular awareness of how it looked, because he was not thinking about how he looked. He was thinking about her. She could see it in the quality of his attention, the full weight of it, directed entirely at the doorway where she appeared. Beside him, Marcus walked out of place for a moment. Technically, he was supposed to have gone ahead to stand with Damien, but he'd stayed beside Claire until they were nearly at the front, and then he'd given her arm a brief, firm squeeze and walked up to stand next to Damien. Sophie and Emma were already at the front, having processed with great ceremony and variable coordination. Emma had stopped twice to look at the flowers, and Sophie had whispered corrections to her trajectory with sisterly patience. Damien was fighting something. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the brightness of his eyes, the specific look of a man who has decided he's not going to cry and is losing the negotiation. She reached him. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," he said. His voice was not fully steady. "You're going to cry," she said. "I'm absolutely not," he said. He cried. Not dramatically. 2 tears, controlled, which he appeared to find deeply irritating. Sophie noticed and made a face that meant I knew it. Marcus noticed and kept his own expression entirely neutral, which was its own form of mercy. Emma, from her position beside Sophie, looked at the room, looked at Gerald and Sophie's bouquet, looked at the 2 people standing at the altar, and announced at a volume slightly larger than the moment called for, "Are they married yet?" The room laughed. The officiant, a woman Diane had recommended who did ceremonies without requiring the participants to perform, looked at the children and then at Damien and Claire and smiled. "Not yet," she said. "We're getting there." During the vows, which Damien had written himself, and which were plain and specific and true, not poetry, not borrowed cadence, just the things he meant in the words he would actually use, Sophie and Emma sat together in the front row. Somewhere in the middle of it, Emma reached over and took Sophie's hand. Sophie, without looking down, without any acknowledgement that she'd noticed, held on. The whole room saw it. The woman beside Diane quietly handed Diane a tissue without being asked. Damien saw it too from the altar, and the jaw thing failed entirely. Claire saw it and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which did not help. When it was done, when the words were said and the rings exchanged and the officiant pronounced them and Damien kissed her in the straightforward and complete way he did most things, the first sound in the room was Emma saying yay with the enthusiasm of a 5-year-old at the conclusion of something she'd been waiting for. And the second sound was the room laughing, and the third sound was everything at once. Sophie and Emma ran toward each other from opposite sides of the aisle. Sophie having stepped away to stand near Margaret, Emma having been sitting beside Diane, and they collided in the middle in a tangle of flower girl dresses and a bouquet that shed half its petals on impact, and Gerald falling to the floor and being immediately retrieved and held aloft like a trophy. Marcus stood beside Damien. He looked at the 2 girls in the aisle. He looked at his mother, who was still standing at the altar with tears drying on her face and her new husband's hand in both of hers. He put his hands in his pockets the way he did when he was satisfied with something and didn't need to say so. Damien looked at him. Marcus met his eyes. And for that one moment, without words, without ceremony, without anyone else noticing, the look passed between them that meant everything had been decided, and the decision was good, and whatever came next, they were going to face it together. The reception ran long because everyone stayed, because that was what happened when people were genuinely happy rather than obligated, and because Emma fell asleep under a table around 9 p.m. and was discovered by Patricia in a nest of flower petals with Gerald in her arms. And the photograph someone took of that became the photograph that ended up in a frame on the mantel of a house that 3 weeks later would hold all 5 of them. Claire danced once with Damien to a song neither of them had selected. It had appeared on the playlist that Sophie had apparently edited at some point without asking, a song that was slower and more deliberate than the surrounding choices, which had the fingerprints of a child who had thought about it. "Did Sophie pick this song?" Claire asked against his shoulder. "Almost certainly," he said. "She's 8. She has opinions." She has very specific opinions, Claire said. They swayed in the middle of the floor, slightly out of step because neither of them was a dancer, which didn't matter. Are you okay? He asked. She thought about the bathroom floor in the apartment, about Marcus in the hallway in his pajamas, about the ring and the galaxy photograph, and the 1037 question in the dark. Yes, she said. For the first time in a long time, I'm actually just okay. He held her, and they moved slowly in the middle of the room, off-tempo, imperfect, surrounded by the particular evidence of a life that had not been planned or performed but had been built, piece by piece, from two broken things that had somehow fit together. Outside, the city did what cities do, kept going, indifferent and loud and full. But in here, the floor held, and the people stayed, and the night was something that would be remembered. The first year of the marriage was not what either of them had imagined, which was probably accurate for most first years, and certainly accurate for this one. They moved into Damien's house in December, a 4-bedroom brownstone in Rittenhouse Square that was large and well-maintained and had been, before Claire and the kids arrived, extremely quiet. The quiet had been something Damien had grown accustomed to in the way people grow accustomed to things that aren't good for them. Not comfortable exactly, but familiar enough to mistake for comfort. The first week with all 5 of them under the same roof dismantled the quiet so completely that he sometimes stood in the kitchen at 7 a.m. listening to the noise of it. Emma narrating something to Gerald in the next room, Marcus's shower running, Sophie arguing with the bathroom mirror about her hair, and felt the specific, slightly startled relief of a house that was finally being used for what houses were built for. Claire, for her part, moved through the first weeks with the careful attention of someone learning a new geography. The house was 4 times the size of her South Philly apartment, and she kept catching herself being conscious of the space. Not ungrateful, just aware, the way you're aware of a new coat that doesn't feel like yours yet. She put Emma's dinosaur drawings in the kitchen, which helped. She put the refrigerator photos up, the quizzes, the Franklin Institute picture, and they looked right against the new surface, still themselves. She kept her work schedule for the first 3 months because she needed to. Not financially. That calculus had changed in ways she was still adjusting to, but because nursing was hers, the credential she'd been working toward for 3 years, the version of herself that existed outside of mother and wife and daughter, and all the other things she was to other people. She was a good nursing assistant. She was going to be a better nurse. She'd re-enrolled in the RN program in September. Before the wedding, fitting classes into the spaces between shifts with the practice deficiency, she'd applied to everything that mattered for the last 4 years. Damien had not suggested the re-enrollment. He'd found out when she mentioned it one evening in October, and his response had been, "What do you need from me to make the schedule work?" That question. The specific shape of it. Not, "I'll pay for it," or "I'll handle everything else," or "You don't have to work at all anymore," all of which would have been the wrong answer in different ways. Just, "What do you need from me?" The question that treated her as the architect of her own life and positioned him as a resource rather than a replacement. She thought about that question often in the first year when things were hard, and things were hard regularly, because this is what the merged life of 2 families with complicated histories actually looks like from the inside. Sophie and Emma were straightforward, mostly because they'd been doing this for a year already and had reached some equilibrium. They shared a bathroom on the 2nd floor and had developed a morning routine that involved Sophie organizing Emma's hair, while Emma held a running conference with Gerald about the day's schedule. And this worked, which was more than could be said for most bathroom arrangements. They were not sisters the way sisters who grew up together were sisters. They'd arrived at each other too late for that, and there was still a quality of chosenness in how they treated each other, a slightly deliberate care that actual siblings rarely bother with. But they were real. Whatever they were, it was real. Marcus and Sophie were more complicated because Marcus was 12 in the way that 12-year-olds are. Not quite the child he'd been, and not the teenager he was becoming, standing in the doorway between the 2 versions of himself with the specific impatience of someone being asked to wait for something he can already see. Sophie was 9 and still fully herself in the unselfconscious way of 9, and Marcus sometimes found this exhausting and sometimes found it clarifying, and he was not always graceful about the difference. There was a fight in February, the first real one, not the kids bickering kind, but the kind that required adult involvement, the kind that left something in the air of the house for 3 days afterward. Marcus had said something to Sophie about her math homework that had been unkind in the specific way of someone who is smart, and sometimes uses it as a weapon. And Sophie had cried, which Marcus hadn't expected and which had made him defensive rather than apologetic, and Damien had walked into the middle of it and gotten it wrong initially. His instinct to protect Sophie had shown first, and Marcus had seen that, and the dynamic of your daughter versus my son had appeared briefly and horribly between them. He'd handled it badly for about 4 minutes. He'd caught himself. He'd started over. "Marcus," he'd said, going to find the boy in his room. "I want to start over." Marcus was at his desk, not reading, just sitting. He looked up with the expression he used when he was holding something tight. "I came in and my first move was to make sure Sophie was okay," Damien said. "That was wrong. She's fine. What you said was unkind, but she's not hurt, and you needed me to come find you first. I got it backward." Marcus was quiet. "What you said to her wasn't okay," Damien continued, "and I think you know that already. But the reason you said it matters too. What's going on?" The reason, it turned out, was a presentation at school that Marcus had bombed. His first real academic failure. A presentation on early space exploration that he'd underprepared because he'd assumed his knowledge of the subject would carry him, and it hadn't, and the teacher had said so in front of the class, and Marcus had been carrying it for 2 days without telling anyone, because telling anyone would mean admitting he'd gotten something wrong. He'd come home and found Sophie confidently incorrect about long division, and something in him had snapped. They'd sat in Marcus's room for 40 minutes. Damien had told him about the Kensington property, the one he'd bought at 23, and the inspection report he'd read wrong. And the afternoon he'd stood in a building he'd just purchased and realized the structural issue that the report had missed, and that he'd missed in the report, and what it had cost him to fix, and what it had cost him to admit he'd been wrong. "Did you tell anyone?" Marcus asked. "My lawyer," Damien said, "because I had to. And my mother." "What did she say?" "She said everybody reads something wrong eventually," Damien said. "The question is whether you let it make you more careful or more afraid." Marcus turned that over. "Those are different?" "More careful means you go back and check things you're sure about. More afraid means you stop trusting your own judgment." A pause. "One of those is useful, and one will cost you more over time than the original mistake." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I have to apologize to Sophie," he said, like it was a decision he'd arrived at himself rather than been directed toward. "Yeah," Damien said. "You do." He did. It was brief and slightly stiff in the way Marcus's apologies were, but it was genuine, and Sophie received it with the directness she'd inherited from her father. "Okay, thanks." And the matter was closed in the Sophie sense, which was completely and without residue. The air in the house cleared within a day, but what Damien carried from it, privately, was the reminder that what he was doing here was not managing a blended household with a set of best practices and a good attitude. It was harder than that. It was the ongoing work of being present for people who needed different things at different moments, and getting it wrong sometimes, and starting over, and getting it less wrong the next time. It was not elegant. It was not resolved. It was just continuous, an act of daily recommitment to the thing he'd promised in the old city venue in November. Claire knew he'd gone to find Marcus. She'd heard them talking through the door, not the words, just the low, steady rhythm of Damien's voice and the shorter responses from Marcus, the particular cadence of a conversation being handled rather than avoided. She'd stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to it, and felt something settle. She thought about Kevin, who had never once gone to find Marcus, who had treated her children as furniture, not unkindly in the early years, but not fully present either, who had looked at Marcus's books and his questions and his particular focused intensity and called it a lot in the way people describe children they don't know how to reach, who had looked at a toddler, Emma, and seen obligation rather than person. She thought about the difference between someone who shows up and someone who shows up for you. The distinction was enormous. She hadn't understood how enormous until she'd seen both. The RN program took her 2 years. She graduated on a Thursday afternoon in May, when Marcus was 14 and Emma was 7 and Sophie was 11, in a ceremony at a conference center in Center City that was small and professional and entirely hers. Damien was there with all 3 kids, seated in the 3rd row. Emma still in her school clothes because there hadn't been time to go home and change. Sophie in the dress she'd chosen herself. Marcus in his good jacket because he'd known in advance and had prepared without being asked. When they called her name, she walked across the stage and received her degree, and she heard, in the middle of the polite, collective applause of a room full of people receiving credentials, Emma's voice, carrying from the third row with the specific volume Emma applied to things she was enthusiastic about. "That's my mom." The woman next to Damien in the third row turned and smiled at Emma. "She's a nurse," Emma explained to the stranger. "And also, she's my mom." Claire heard it from the stage. She pressed her lips together hard, walked back to her seat, and did not fully hold it together, which she'd told herself she would. Afterward, in the lobby, Damien handed her the flowers Sophie had picked. Not roses, because Sophie had learned her mother's preferences, and her mother didn't love roses, so she'd gotten ranunculus in the orange and red range that Claire actually liked, and said R.N. Monroe. "Hayes," she said. R.N. Hayes. He smiled in the way he did when something landed squarely. R.N. Hayes, he said. Marcus stood slightly apart from the group, which was his habit in large rooms, and when Claire reached him, he didn't say anything, just held out his hand for a formal handshake that he'd clearly been planning because it was such a Marcus thing, the mock solemnity of it, the deliberate echo of an adult interaction. And she'd shaken his hand with matching gravity and then pulled him into a hug that he'd allowed for a full 6 seconds, which was long for Marcus. 3 years, he said, against her shoulder. "You did it in 3 years while working." "With help," she said. He didn't argue with that. He'd been part of the help. Homework, the nights he'd managed Emma's dinner when Claire had classes, the times he'd set his alarm for 6 a.m. to make sure Emma got up and dressed on the mornings Claire was working the overnight. He'd been part of the help in ways she'd tried to acknowledge without making him feel burdened by it, the specific balance of a child who has grown up fast and needs to be seen for it without being asked to carry it. She saw him. She always had. Kevin came back in the spring of the following year. Marcus was 15 by then. He didn't call ahead, which was either poor planning or a deliberate strategy to avoid being told not to come. And Claire had long since stopped trying to interpret his choices in terms that gave him too much credit or too little. He just appeared on a Tuesday afternoon at the house in Rittenhouse Square, a man standing on the front stoop of an address he'd found somehow, looking like someone who had been building up to something and was not fully sure it had been a good idea. Claire answered the door. She'd opened it expecting the FedEx delivery that Patricia had told her was coming, and instead she found Kevin Monroe, 5 years older than the last time she'd seen him, which was Easter 2 years before the wedding, the afternoon Marcus had said we were eating lunch and gone back to the table. He looked like himself but softer around the edges, the specific softness that came from something that wasn't health. He had a haircut that was too deliberate, the kind men get when they're trying to look like they're doing well. He had his hands in his pockets. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Claire," he said. "Kevin." Her voice was even. She'd had a long time to practice this. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the city," he said. "I wanted to—" He stopped, looked past her into the house, briefly. "I heard you got married." 2 years ago." "Yeah." He nodded at nothing. "And the kids? They're good?" "Yes," she said. "They're good." She did not move back from the doorway to let him in. Not from cruelty. She was past the anger, mostly, the way you get past things that stop being worth the energy they require. But because letting him in was not something she owed him, and she'd spent enough years confusing obligation with generosity. "Can I—" He stopped again. "I'd like to see them. If that's—" "They're at school," she said, "and I think you'd need to give more notice than this, Kevin. They have their lives. They have routines." He looked at the ground. "I know I've been absent," she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. "I've been absent," he agreed. He said it like a man who had rehearsed the acknowledgement but hadn't gotten further than that. "I'm trying to—" He gestured vaguely. "I'm working on some things." She looked at him. The man she'd married at 26, the man she'd believed in when she was trying to build a life and hadn't known yet what the building required, the man who had left her with an 8-month-old and a 6-year-old and a lease in both their names, and the slow, dismantling realization that she'd been alone in the marriage for a long time before she was actually alone. She felt nothing sharp. That surprised her, still, that the sharpness was gone. There was something duller there. Not quite pity, not quite indifference, somewhere between them. "Okay," she said, "work on your things. When you've worked on them, you can contact me through the number I have and we'll figure out what's appropriate for the kids." A pause. "But Kevin, Marcus is 15. He remembers things. Don't come back unless you mean it. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that might have been shame or the beginning of it. Is he... Kevin stopped. Is he doing okay? Marcus? He's exceptional, she said, simply and without the need to make it sting because it was just true. He's the most exceptional person I know. Kevin nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I can see that. He paused. You did that. She looked at him for a moment. Not just me, she said. He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the front steps and along the sidewalk, a man with his hands in his pockets walking away from the house that didn't belong to him. And she felt the full weight of everything he'd given up. Not her. She'd been fine. In the end, she'd been more than fine. But Marcus at 6 and Emma as a baby, and every year between then and now, the science projects and the planetarium and the 94 quiz and the graduation in the morning. Emma had called Damien Dad without thinking about it. All of it, irrecoverable, gone by choice. She closed the door. Damien was in his office on the 3rd floor, on a call that had started at 2 and was still going at 4, which was the specific purgatory of real estate development at the scale he operated, and she knocked and opened the door, and he looked up and read her face and said into the phone, I need 5 minutes. Hold on. Kevin was here, she said. He looked at her. Are you okay? Yes, she said. She meant it. He wanted to see the kids. I told him to give notice and to not come back unless he meant it. She leaned against the door frame. I don't know if he will. What do you need? That question, always that question. Nothing, she said. I just wanted to tell you. Do Marcus and Emma need to know? She thought about it. Marcus might need to know. Not today, but before Kevin comes back, if he does. A pause. He'll want to process it himself. I'll talk to him if you want, Damien said. Or you can. Or both. Let me do it, she said. But stay available. Always, he said. She went back downstairs. He went back to his call. She told Marcus that night, after Emma was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table, their table still, even here, still the place where the real conversations happened. She told him simply and without editorializing. Kevin had come. Kevin had asked about him. She'd told Kevin to give notice and mean it before coming back. Marcus listened with his hands flat on the table, which was a thing he'd started doing in the last year, and she noticed it and did not say anything about it. Did you let him in? Marcus asked. No, she said. Marcus nodded. He asked if you were okay, she said. I told him you were exceptional. Something moved across Marcus's face. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. Do you think he'll come back? I don't know, she said honestly. Do you want him to? She thought about it. I want him to do whatever is going to be real, she said. For your sake and Emma's. Not a visit with presents and then gone again. Real. She paused. But that's his work to do, not ours. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He was taller than her now, had been for about 6 months, which she still hadn't fully absorbed. He sat at the kitchen table in the house that was no longer her apartment and looked at his mother with the 15-year-old version of the face she'd known since he was born. I don't need him, Marcus said. Not bitterly. Not as a declaration of triumph or wound, just as information, delivered in the factual way he delivered most things. I've figured out what a father looks like. I know what it actually means. He glanced toward the ceiling, toward the 3rd floor where the sound of Damien's call had long since stopped. I'm good. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned it over and held it for a moment, the way he had when he was small and hadn't started yet on the managed self-containment that adolescence was building in him. Then he let go, picked up his phone, and said, I have homework, and went upstairs. Kevin called twice over the following year. Once she answered, once she didn't. The conversations were short. He was still working on things, he said, still figuring out the logistics, still meaning to. She received this information the way she received most things now, clearly, without attachment to the outcome, without the hope or the bracing that used to accompany anything involving Kevin. The children knew he'd called. Marcus's response was minimal, a nod, a return to whatever he'd been doing. Emma asked if he was going to visit, and Claire said maybe someday, and Emma said okay and asked if Gerald needed a bath, because Gerald was looking dusty, which was an accurate observation and a complete pivot, and that was that. He stopped calling after the 2nd year. The years that followed were not a resolution of anything. That was the thing nobody told you about building a life. that it didn't resolve, that it didn't arrive at a state of completion and rest there, that the work was ongoing and sometimes the work was hard. There were bad nights and sick kids and professional stress and the specific friction of 5 people with different needs and rhythms sharing a house and a life. Marcus went through a stretch at 16 where he was closed off and difficult, and Damien got it wrong twice before he found the right way in. And Sophie went through a thing at 13 that required more from Claire than Claire had known she had. And Emma broke her arm in 5th grade, and the ER visit opened something in Claire that she hadn't known was still close to the surface. The old hospital waiting room version of herself that flinched at fluorescent lights and hard plastic chairs. But Damien was there. Every time. Not perfectly. He got things wrong, and said the wrong thing, and sometimes prioritized work in the old way, and caught himself and recalibrated. He was not the version of himself he'd been before Rachel, the one who'd worked 17-hour days and called it building something. He was something different, still driven, still capable of the focus that had built the company from nothing, but with an understanding now of what focus cost when it was aimed at the wrong things. He showed up for school events, not just the big ones, the graduations and the plays and the championships, but the middle ones, the ones that were important specifically to the kid in question and nobody else. Marcus's regional science fair at 14, which he'd won and which had been attended by exactly 11 parents total, and Damien had been one of them. Emma's 2nd grade dinosaur report, which she delivered to her class with an authority that her teacher had described as commanding, and which Damien had sat through wearing a paper dinosaur hat that Emma had made him put on at the door and which he had worn without comment. Sophie's volleyball games in high school. All of them, when he could, and when he couldn't, he had someone record it, and he watched that night without being asked. He was, in the language of parenting that nobody uses out loud but everyone understands, present. Not the performative present of someone doing their duty, but the genuine article. The kind that means you know which child is afraid of what, which one processes things alone first, and which one needs the conversation immediately. Which one needs to be held, and which one needs to be left alone, and which one needs to be asked the direct question because they will not volunteer the answer. He learned all of it. He kept learning. Claire finished her RN certification and moved into a position at Jefferson that was more aligned with what she wanted. A patient care role in a unit where her experience meant something, where she was good at the thing she was doing rather than just capable of it. She was, by the time Marcus was in college and Emma was in middle school, someone who moved through her professional life with a confidence that bore no resemblance to the woman who had sat in a hospital waiting room 7 years earlier, apologizing to strangers for a spilled cup of juice. That woman hadn't disappeared. Claire carried her the way you carry the person you used to be. Not with shame, not with nostalgia, but as context. As the before that made the after legible. She thought about her sometimes. The 30-year-old in the blue scrubs beneath the fluorescent light, holding a sleeping child and bracing for the next thing, and she felt something toward her that was close to tenderness. She'd been managing so much. She'd been holding so much together with such insufficient materials. She'd been, without knowing it, in the waiting room where her life was about to change. Marcus was 17 when he told Damien he wanted to study astrophysics. He said it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the same directness he'd used for everything since he was 9. No preamble, no softening, just, I've been thinking about what I want to study. I want to do astrophysics. Damien put down his coffee. MIT or Caltech? Marcus looked at him. I haven't gotten in yet. Which one are you applying to? Both, Marcus said, and Princeton. Then MIT or Caltech, Damien said. Marcus almost smiled. You don't have a preference? I have a preference for wherever they're going to give you the most room, Damien said. What do you need from me for the applications? That question again, the same question in this context, in this version, still the question that treated the person in front of him as the one who knew what they needed. Honestly, Marcus said, I want you to read my essays. Done. And Marcus paused. He had his hands flat on the table. He was looking at his coffee mug, then at Damien. I've been thinking about what to put for the section about people who influenced me. The people who shaped how I think. Damien held his gaze. I'm going to put you, Marcus said. If that's okay. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. That's more than okay, Damien said. His voice came out slightly wrong, which he didn't try to fix. Marcus nodded, picked up his coffee. I'll send you the drafts this week, he said. and moved on because that was Marcus. He said the real thing and then moved on because the saying was enough and he didn't need to stand in it. Emma started calling Damien Dad the way she called him anything, without occasion, without announcement, simply because it had become the word that fit. She was 7 the first time, the night with the ear infection that Marcus had told Damien about in September, the night Marcus had stood in the dark and asked if Damien was going to disappear. She'd said it in the half-conscious way of a feverish child being carried to bed, not fully aware of what she was saying, and Damien had said, "Okay, you're okay. I've got you," without making it into anything. She'd said it again the next morning, fully awake this time. "Dad, where's my other shoe?" And he'd found the shoe, which was under the couch where Emma's shoes reliably ended up. And that had been that. Sophie had made the transition gradually in the way she did things, considered, deliberate, and then completely. She was 10 when she first used the word for Claire, not mom because Rachel was mom and would always be mom, but something adjacent, something that acknowledged what Claire was without replacing what Rachel had been. She called her Claire for years, and then one evening, when she was 12 and had come home from school raw and upset about something that had happened with a friend group, she'd walked into the kitchen where Claire was making dinner and said, without precedent, "Can I talk to you? Like, as a person who knows me." "Always," Claire had said. She'd turned off the burner. They'd sat at the table for an hour. Claire had not tried to fix it, had not offered the perspective that made it easier to hold, had not done the thing that well-meaning adults do when they redirect a child's pain toward its silver lining. She'd just listened and asked questions when the questions were useful and sat with Sophie in the messy, unresolved reality of it. After that, Sophie called her Claire, and also sometimes, not always, not as a replacement, but sometimes, something that sounded like it wanted to be something more. And Claire received it each time with the same quiet care, neither making too much of it nor not enough. Rachel was present in the house. This was something Damien had worked at deliberately and Claire had supported without reservation, because she understood, as a woman who had watched her own children carry an absent father, who knew the specific damage of a parent-shaped hole, that what Sophie needed was not for Rachel to be replaced, but for Rachel to remain real. There was a photograph in the living room, a good one taken when Sophie was 18 months old, Rachel looking at the camera with the impatient, clear-eyed directness Marcus had identified in her father's description. Sophie talked about her mother with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had been given permission to do so, who had never been made to feel that talking about her was a problem, that the grief needed to be managed for other people's comfort. Claire had never once made it a problem. That, more than anything, was the thing Damien could not have anticipated when he'd first met her. The generosity of her. Not the performed generosity of someone being good on purpose, but the deep structural generosity of a woman who had been through enough to understand that love was not a finite resource, and that making room for Rachel did not diminish anything between them. He loved her for many things. That was at the top. 20 years after the first dinner, they went back. It wasn't planned as a commemorative event. He'd made the reservation at the restaurant on Spruce Street, the one with the good food and the low lighting and the tables spaced far enough apart. And Claire had asked why there specifically, and he'd reminded her, and she'd looked at him with the expression she used when something caught her sideways. "You remember the restaurant," she said. "I remember the whole night," he said. "You sat down and immediately told me I should walk away. I was giving you an accurate picture of the situation." "You were," he said. "I was not interested in walking away." The restaurant had changed slightly. Different ownership, different menu, the same bones. They sat at a table near the window, which was where they'd been the first time, though neither of them could have said with certainty that this was the same table. The city moved outside on the other side of the glass, November now as it had been then, the lights going early. Marcus was 29 in a PhD program in theoretical physics at Caltech, the Caltech over the MIT, which had surprised nobody who knew him and which he'd chosen because of a specific research program in cosmology that he'd been corresponding with faculty about since he was 18. He had a girlfriend who was a structural engineer and who had the specific quality Marcus had always been drawn to in people: direct, efficient, not inclined to perform. Claire and Damien had met her at Thanksgiving and liked her immediately in the plain, unguarded way you like people who are good for people you love. Emma was 24, in her second year of veterinary school in Philadelphia, which meant she came to dinner every few weeks and still kept Gerald on her bookshelf, a fact she neither acknowledged nor tried to hide. She had not, as far as anyone could tell, outgrown dinosaurs, which remained one of Damien's favorite things about her. Sophie was 28, in her second year as a landscape architect for a firm that did urban green space design, which was, when Damien thought about it, exactly right. Sophie, who had picked flowers for the wedding with the authority of a small general. Sophie, who had always thought about how spaces should be used, what they should make people feel, how the built environment could be something other than just present. She called Claire every Sunday, a habit she'd started in college and kept without interruption. She called Damien on Tuesdays, which was the day he'd always been more available, and she said she liked Tuesdays better anyway, which was something she'd decided at 13 and maintained. Damien looked across the candlelit table at his wife. She was 50 years old and she looked it, which was what 50 looked like when you'd lived something real, not old, not diminished, but marked in the ways that a life marks you. The laugh lines were his favorite thing about her face because they were recent, most of them, earned in the last 10 years. And he knew what each year had contributed. He knew the year of Marcus's college acceptance, and the year Sophie had called Claire something that wanted to be more, and the year Emma had graduated from her undergraduate program and stood on the stage and looked out at all 5 of them in the audience and grinned with the whole of her face. He knew the year Claire's mother had died and the specific texture of that grief, and the year she'd finally let herself believe without the waiting, without the flinch, that this was actually her life. She was looking at the menu she'd already read. He knew she was looking at the menu because she wasn't ready to look at him. And she wasn't ready to look at him because this restaurant and this night and the specific weight of 20 years were sitting on the table between them, and it was a lot to hold while maintaining composure. And Claire, even now, preferred to maintain composure when possible. He waited. She put the menu down. She looked at him across the candlelight, and he looked at her, and all of it was there. The hospital waiting room and the parking lot and the kitchen table and the Saturn ring and the question in the dark and the bathroom floor and the aisle and the years, all the ordinary, irreplaceable years that were the architecture of everything real. "I almost pushed you away," she said. Her voice was quiet and not quite steady. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "Every time," she said, "at the dinner and after and at the proposal and at the wedding, I kept looking for the exit because I kept being sure you were going to take it." "I know," he said. "How were you never—" She stopped. "How did you just keep being there?" He thought about the right way to say it. The honest way, not the version that sounded like a line. "Because I was already home," he said. From that night in the waiting room, something in me recognized. This. You. That table you 3 were at, with the juice on the floor and Marcus's face, and you apologizing to people who didn't deserve it. He paused. "I didn't know what it was yet, but I didn't want to leave." She looked at him. Her eyes were doing the thing. "Don't," she said to herself. "You can," he said. "I'm fine," she said, which was not true. "Claire, I'm fine." She pressed her free hand under her eye for a second. 20 years and you still— She stopped, shook her head slightly, the smallest motion. "Still what?" he said. She looked at him with the full, unguarded version of her face, the one that had taken years to show him and now lived closer to the surface, the one that contained all the things she'd been afraid to be seen having. "Still the same," she said. "You're still exactly the same person who got on the floor of a hospital waiting room to clean up orange juice. You never—" She paused. "A lot of people are one person to get you and another person after. You're the same." He turned her hand over in his. "So are you," he said. She looked at the candle, then back at him. "I stopped apologizing," she said. "That changed." "That changed," he agreed. "Everything else is the same." She was quiet for a moment, looking at their hands on the table. The ring was still there, the round stone in the plain setting, a little worn now, the surface of it no longer quite new. She'd offered once, a few years in, to have it refinished, and he'd said no. He liked it the way it was, and she'd understood what he meant. "Do you know what Marcus said to me last week?" she said. "What?" He said. She almost smiled. He said he's been thinking about the structure of things, of relationships, of families. And he said the thing he keeps coming back to is that the strongest structures aren't the ones that had no pressure on them. They're the ones that were built to handle it. Damien looked at her. "He said he thinks about us when he thinks about structural integrity," she said. He said that like it was the highest compliment he knew how to give. "It is," Damien said. "From Marcus. It is." She laughed. That real one, the one she'd let out in the parking lot 14 years ago when he'd asked about Sophie's hand, and Sophie had told him about the narrative she'd constructed around the scar, and which had come out startled and genuine and had landed somewhere in his chest and never fully left. Outside, the city went on. The lights on Spruce Street, the people in their coats moving through the November dark, the whole busy, beautiful, indifferent world. Inside, two people sat at a table that might or might not have been the same table as 20 years before, and held hands across the candlelight, and were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they don't need to fill the space. There were no perfect endings here. Kevin was still out there somewhere, still the absence at the edge of Marcus and Emma's story, a fact that would always be true, and that had long since lost its power to define anything. Rachel was still a photograph in the living room, and a quality in Sophie's jaw, and an impatience in her daughter's eyes, present in the way that people are present when the people who love them do the work of keeping them real. There were still hard nights and wrong words, and things that got carried too long before they were put down. But Damian Hayes had stopped fearing quiet rooms. He'd stopped measuring his life in the distance between himself and the thing he'd lost. He'd started measuring it the way it deserved to be measured, in the people around the table, in the conversations at midnight, in the questions asked and the questions answered, and the small, ordinary moments that accumulated into a life that was, against the odds of all the ways it could have not been this, genuinely good. And Claire Monroe, Claire Hayes, had stopped apologizing for existing, had stopped waiting for the exit to appear, had stopped preparing for the love to reveal its cost. She'd been afraid for a long time that wanting something real was the thing that made you a target. She understood now that it was the thing that made you a person, the truest lesson of her life, the one she'd learned not from a book or a program or anything anyone had told her, but from 10 years of being in a room with a man who showed up, was this. Love was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stay anyway, to show up to the kitchen table and the waiting room and the 2 a.m. and the birthday and the hard conversation and the next day and the day after that, without the guarantee of anything except that you meant it and you were there. She'd learned it. She'd lived it. And she'd passed it to 3 children who were now in their different ways building their own structures out in the world. Marcus with his cosmology and his engineer girlfriend, Emma with her veterinary medicine and her Gerald-adjacent adulthood, Sophie with her green spaces and her Tuesday calls. And she could see it in all of them, the capacity for it, the knowledge somewhere in them that staying was the thing, that showing up was the thing, that the person worth having is the person who, when they find you in the place where everything is hard and the light is unflattering and the juice is on the floor, gets down on the ground and helps you clean it up, and doesn't ask to be thanked, and doesn't leave. The waiter came and they ordered and they ate and they talked about Marcus's research and Emma's coursework and Sophie's project in North Philly, a green corridor through a neighborhood that had needed one for 30 years. And the night stretched on the way good nights do when nobody is watching the clock. At some point, walking out into the November cold, their breath visible in the air, his hand finding hers in the way it always did, Claire looked up at the city above them. The lit windows, the bare trees, the particular quality of the sky above a place that had become, over 20 years and entirely without ceremony, home. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He pulled her hand into the pocket of his coat, and they walked.